Hello and welcome. I hope you all enjoy tonight's cryptid horror stories. Shadows of the Yowie. The ancient eucalyptus forest of the Megalong Valley had stood for millennia, its gnarled roots drinking from hidden aquifers deep beneath the iron-rich soil, its canopy filtering the harsh Australian sun into dappled patterns that danced across the forest floor like living spirits. And among those trees, something ancient and terrible had made its home long before the first human had set foot on the southern continent. Something that walked on two legs and possessed a cunning that belied its bestial appearance. Something that the indigenous peoples had known and feared for thousands of years, calling it by names that translated roughly to hairy man, or forest devil, or simply the one who waits. A creature of legend that was about to prove itself terrifyingly real to a group of scientists who had ventured into its domain with equipment and curiosity, but without the understanding that some mysteries were meant to remain hidden. Some creatures were meant to remain unproven, and some forests were meant to remain unexplored. Dr. Sarah Chen stood at the edge of the research camp on the morning of their third day in the valley, her weathered boots sinking slightly into the decomposing leaf litter as she surveyed the wilderness that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. An unbroken carpet of blue-gray gum trees that seemed to breathe with its own ancient rhythm, and she felt the familiar thrill of discovery mixed with an unease she could not quite name, a sensation of being watched that had plagued her since they had first established camp at the base of Narrowneck Plateau. She had spent 15 years studying cryptozoology, chasing whispers of creatures that science refused to acknowledge, from the Himalayan Yeti to the North American Sasquatch, always returning with interesting anecdotes but no definitive proof. Always facing the skepticism of her colleagues and the mockery of the press, but something about this expedition felt different, heavier, as though the forest itself were watching her with eyes that predated human existence, as though the trees were whispering warnings in a language too old for her to understand. Her research team consisted of 12 individuals, herself as lead investigator, her graduate assistant Marcus Webb, wildlife photographer Jennifer Torres, local indigenous guide David Yaron, veterinarian Dr. Robert Klein, geologist Dr. Elena Vasquez, sound engineer Paul Hendricks, botanist Dr. Maya Singh, survival expert Jake Morrison, medical technician Sophia Rodriguez, park ranger Ben Harris, and wealthy benefactor and amateur naturalist Richard Blackwood, who had funded the entire expedition in exchange for the exclusive documentation rights to whatever they might discover. A man whose obsession with proving the existence of the Yowie bordered on the pathological, and who had sunk nearly $2 million into this venture without a single guarantee of success. They had established camp at the base of Narrowneck Plateau 3 days prior, setting up high-tech motion sensor cameras throughout a 10-kilometer radius, hoping to capture evidence of the creature that indigenous Australians had spoken of for tens of thousands of years, the Yowie, the hairy man of the bush, the giant hominid that supposedly stalked these remote valleys with footsteps that shook the earth and a scream that echoed like thunder across the escarpments. A creature that mainstream science dismissed as mass hysteria or misidentified wildlife, but which Sarah suspected, based on her years of research, might actually exist, might be a surviving population of Gigantopithecus or Homo erectus, or some other ancient hominid that had somehow persisted into the modern era in the remote and inaccessible regions of the Australian wilderness. The first day had been uneventful, the team conducting preliminary surveys of the terrain, taking soil samples and cataloging the local flora, noting with interest the unusual abundance of kangaroo carcasses in the area, animals that had been torn apart with such violence that Sarah had initially suspected a rogue pack of dingoes. Though the bite patterns and the sheer force required to dismember a fully grown eastern gray kangaroo seemed beyond any canine predator native to the continent, the wounds too deep, too ragged, as though inflicted by something with teeth like daggers and jaws like a bear trap. David Yaron had remained quiet during these discussions, his dark eyes scanning the tree line with a wariness that made Sarah uncomfortable, his normally jovial demeanor replaced by a solemnity that spoke of ancestral knowledge. And when she pressed him for his thoughts, he spoke in a low voice that seemed to carry the weight of generations, telling her that his people, the Gundungura, knew this place as Yowie country, that the old stories spoke of a creature that walked between worlds, neither fully animal nor spirit but something older and hungrier than either, something that did not forgive trespass and could smell human fear like a dog smells meat, something that had been here since the dream time and would be here long after the last human had turned to dust. Sarah had dismissed his warnings as cultural superstition, grateful for his expertise in navigating the terrain, but privately believing that his tales were as much folklore as the creature they sought, though she noted the way he refused to sleep in the tents closest to the forest edge, preferring instead to bed down in the center of camp, surrounded by the others as though their numbers might provide some protection that canvas and nylon could not. And she noticed the small bundles of eucalyptus leaves he tied to his tent poles, some kind of ward or offering that he would not explain when asked. On the second morning, Paul Hendricks discovered something that sent a chill through the entire team while checking the audio equipment he had positioned along a ridge line a kilometer north of camp, returning with a recording device clutched in trembling hands and a face pale as bone beneath his sun-weathered tan, his eyes wide and glassy with an expression of shock that Sarah had only seen before in soldiers suffering from combat trauma. He told them that he had heard something in the pre-dawn darkness while checking the equipment, something that had started as a mimicry of bird calls but had shifted into a sound that resembled a woman screaming, then a baby crying, then something that had no name in any human language, a bellowing roar that had vibrated in his chest and caused him to void his bladder without realizing it, leaving a dark stain on his khaki shorts that he had not bothered to hide in his rush to return to the safety of camp, his voice trembling as he described how the sound had seemed to come from all around him, as though the creature was circling him in the dark, studying him, and how he had run back to camp without looking back, expecting at any moment to feel massive hands grab him from behind and drag him into the forest. They played the recording back through the portable speakers, the digital clarity capturing every nuance of the soundscape, the normal background noise of the bush giving way to a silence so complete it seemed manufactured, followed by the mimicry Paul had described, the bird calls so perfect that Sarah initially thought they were listening to actual wildlife, until she realized that no single bird could produce such varied songs in rapid succession. And then came the other sounds, the woman screaming in agony, the infant wailing in terror, each one so perfectly replicated that Jennifer Torres had turned away, covering her mouth with her hand to stifle a sob, thinking of her own daughter back in Sydney. And then finally the roar, a sound like the earth splitting open, like a waterfall of stones, like the rage of something that had waited 10,000 years for this moment and was not about to be denied. The bass frequencies so low that they made the equipment vibrate and set Sarah's teeth on edge with their physicality. Richard Blackwood immediately demanded that they investigate the source of the recording, his eyes gleaming with the avarice of a man who saw fame and fortune in his future, imagining himself standing before cameras explaining how he had brought the world definitive proof of Australia's missing link, his hands shaking with excitement as he grabbed his camera and prepared to head into the forest. But Sarah insisted they maintain protocol, establishing additional security measures around the camp perimeter, stringing tripwires connected to flares, and setting up infrared cameras to monitor any movement in the surrounding forest, her scientific mind fighting a battle against the primitive fear that Paul's recording had awakened in her gut, the understanding that something was out there, something intelligent enough to mimic human sounds, something large enough to make the ground shake with its footsteps. That night, the temperature dropped unexpectedly, a cold front sweeping down from the Blue Mountains that brought with it a fog so thick it reduced visibility to mere meters, transforming the familiar camp into a landscape of ghostly shapes and distorted sounds. The snapping of twigs and rustling of leaves taking on ominous significance as the darkness pressed against the circle of electric light like a living thing trying to force its way inside. The moisture in the air making their breath visible, and their skin clammy with the cold and the fear that seemed to permeate everything. Sarah assigned Jake Morrison and Ben Harris to take first watch, the two men armed with high-powered rifles and night vision equipment, standing back-to-back in the center of camp as the others retreated to their tents, the canvas walls offering only psychological comfort against whatever might be moving through the fog beyond the reach of their headlights. And Sarah lay in her tent listening to the sounds of the forest, the normal noises of the bush somehow amplified by the fog, every crack of a twig sounding like a gunshot, every rustle of leaves like whispered threats. It was Marcus Webb who died first, though they would not find his body until morning, the graduate student having slipped out of his tent sometime after midnight, perhaps to urinate, perhaps drawn by something he thought he heard, a voice that sounded like his mother calling him home, or maybe the cry of an animal in distress that triggered his compassionate instincts. Though Sarah would spend years tormented by the possibility that he had been lured, that the mimicry they had recorded was not merely a defensive mechanism, but a hunting strategy, a way of pulling prey away from the safety of numbers into the darkness where it could be taken without witness, where it could be consumed in peace. They found him at dawn, what remained of him, his body suspended 15 feet above the forest floor in the fork of an ancient gum tree, his torso torn open from throat to groin, his ribs spread like grotesque wings to expose the hollowed cavity where his organs had been removed with surgical precision. The heart and lungs and liver gone, eaten perhaps, his face frozen in an expression of such terror that Jennifer Torres vomited immediately upon seeing it, her breakfast of coffee and muesli splattering across the leaf litter as she turned away. Retching helplessly while Jake Morrison climbed the tree to cut the ropes of twisted vine that held Marcus in place, the man's weight surprisingly light as though something had consumed him from within, leaving only a husk behind. And as Jake lowered the body to the ground, they saw that Marcus's arms were broken, snapped at the elbows and wrists, the bones protruding through the skin in white spikes, as though he had tried to fight, had tried to push away the creature that held him and failed. Sarah documented everything with clinical detachment that she would later recognize as shock, photographing the scene from every angle, noting the way Marcus's blood had spattered the bark in patterns that suggested arterial spray consistent with a wound inflicted, while he was still alive and standing. The droplets reaching distances that indicated massive blood pressure, and therefore a heart that continued beating even as the killing blow was struck. And she found footprints at the base of the tree, impressions in the soft earth that were unmistakably bipedal but far too large to be human. 18 inches in length with splayed toes and a deep heel impression that spoke to a weight exceeding 300 pounds. The stride length between prints indicating a creature that moved on two legs with the fluidity of something born to the upright posture, not the awkward gait of a bear or great ape, but the confident stride of a hunter who knew itself to be apex. And she measured them carefully, her hands shaking, knowing that she was looking at the first definitive proof of the Yowie's existence, proof that would change everything, prove her right, justify her career, if only she could survive long enough to share it with the world. David Yaron refused to look at the body, keeping his eyes fixed on the tree line as he spoke in a voice barely above a whisper, telling Sarah that they needed to leave, that the Yowie had marked Marcus as a warning, that the creature was intelligent enough to understand they were seeking it, and had responded with a display of dominance that was meant to drive them away. But Sarah could not abandon the expedition. Not with the evidence they had collected, the footprints and the recording, and now a body that would prove to the skeptical world that something monstrous lived in these forests. And she insisted they secure the remains and continue the investigation, her ambition warring with the survival instinct that screamed at her to flee while she still could, to run and never look back. They wrapped Marcus in a thermal blanket and stored him in the portable refrigeration unit meant for biological samples, the irony not lost on anyone that the young man who had hoped to study life would now be studied in death, his remains preserved for the autopsy that would follow their return to civilization, though Sarah found herself wondering if any of them would survive to deliver that report. The footprints suggesting a creature of impossible strength and cunning that had bypassed their security measures without triggering a single alarm, entering and leaving the camp with the silence of a ghost and the efficiency of a predator that had perfected its craft over millennia of evolution. And she noticed that David had added more eucalyptus bundles to his tent, his face set in a mask of grim determination as he prepared for something he would not name. The second death came that afternoon, Dr. Robert Klein insisting on examining the area where Marcus had been found, determined to analyze the saliva or hair or any biological material that might have been left behind, his scientific curiosity overriding the fear that had gripped the others, his veterinary expertise telling him that the wounds on the body suggested an animal attack despite the bipedal footprints, his mind unable to reconcile the evidence of his eyes with his training in animal behavior, and he had set off alone despite Sarah's protests, certain that he would find the evidence needed to identify the predator, armed with nothing but his sample kit and his confidence in human rationality. They found him 3 hours after he had left camp, following his radio trail until the signal stopped abruptly at the edge of a ravine, his body lying at the bottom with his neck broken and his skull crushed from above, the pattern of the injury suggesting he had been struck by something massive. A club or a rock or perhaps a fist the size of a dinner plate, and as Jake Morrison rappelled down to retrieve the body, he called up that there were more footprints, dozens of them, surrounding the spot where Klein had fallen as though the creature had watched him die, had perhaps even pushed him, and Sarah felt the cold hand of true fear close around her heart for the first time since the expedition began, realizing that they were not dealing with a mere animal but something that possessed malice, that enjoyed the killing, that was playing with them like a cat plays with mice before the final pounce. And she knew with certainty that Klein had been alive when he fell, that the creature had wanted him to see it, to know what was killing him, and had struck him down with deliberate cruelty. They pulled Klein's body up with considerable difficulty, the man's solid frame weighing heavily on the rope, and when they finally laid him on the forest floor, they saw that his chest bore parallel gouges that had torn through his shirt and into his flesh. 4 parallel wounds on each side that matched the pattern of fingers, impossibly large fingers with claws that had sliced through skin and muscle with the ease of a knife through paper, exposing the ribs beneath. And his face, oh God, his face! His jaw had been dislocated and pulled away from his skull, hanging loose and grotesque as though something had attempted to pry his mouth open, perhaps to peer inside, perhaps to silence him, and his eyes were wide with an expression of surprise that suggested he had seen his killer clearly in the final moments, had recognized something that his scientific mind had refused to believe until it was too late, and Sarah photographed it all, her hands trembling so badly she could barely hold the camera, knowing that she was documenting her own potential fate, that this could be her, would be her, if they didn't find a way to escape. Elena Vasquez discovered that the creature had visited the camp during their absence, the geologist having remained behind to monitor the seismographic equipment she had positioned to detect any underground vibrations that might indicate the movement of a large creature, and she met them with a face as white as chalk, telling them that while they were gone, something had circled the camp, its footsteps leaving impressions in the soft earth that had collapsed the entrance to her tent, that she had watched through a gap in the canvas as something massive moved past her field of vision, something that smelled like wet fur and rotting meat an ancient earth. Something that had paused outside her tent and sniffed the air with audible breaths that sounded like a bellows, hot and moist, and then had moved on, leaving her paralyzed with fear until their return, her hands shaking so badly that she could barely hold her coffee cup, the liquid sloshing over the rim to burn her fingers without her noticing, her voice barely above a whisper as she described the massive shadow that had blocked the light, the shape that was almost human but wrong, the sense of being examined by an intelligence that was ancient and hungry and utterly alien to anything she had ever known. Sarah made the decision to abandon the expedition then, her ambition finally crushed beneath the weight of 2 dead colleagues, and the evidence that something intelligent and malevolent was stalking them. But Richard Blackwood refused to leave, his obsession with capturing the creature on film overriding his survival instinct, arguing that they had come too far and sacrificed too much to turn back now, that the creature was merely defending its territory and would leave them alone if they stopped intruding on its hunting grounds. His voice rising to a near shriek as he brandished the contract they had all signed, reminding them that he had funded this expedition, and they were legally obligated to continue or face financial ruin and professional disgrace. And she saw in his eyes the madness that obsession could bring, the willingness to die for proof, for fame, for the validation of his beliefs, and she knew that he would not leave, would probably die here, and she had to decide whether to stay with him or save herself. The argument lasted until nightfall, the sun dropping behind the escarpment and plunging the valley into premature darkness, the temperature dropping with it until their breath misted in the air, and the metal of their equipment grew too cold to touch without gloves. And it was during this argument that they heard it again, the mimicry, starting with the call of a kookaburra that was answered by another and another, until the bush was filled with the sound of maniacal laughter that built and built until it became something else entirely. Became the scream of a woman in labor, became the wail of a child lost in the dark, became the roar of something that had waited long enough and was coming to collect what was owed. And the sound seemed to come from all around them, circling, moving, getting closer with each passing moment until it was right at the edge of the light, just beyond visibility, waiting. The attack when it came was so sudden that later none of them could agree on exactly what had happened, only that the darkness beyond the camp lights seemed to convulse, and something massive moved through it with impossible speed. Sarah catching glimpses of reddish-brown fur and muscled limbs and eyes that reflected the firelight with an amber glow that held no warmth, only hunger. And then Ben Harris was screaming, the park ranger's rifle firing 3 times into the darkness before something swept his legs out from under him, and he was lifted into the air. His body bent backward over a shoulder that was too broad to be human, his spine snapping with a sound like a green branch breaking. And then he was gone, carried into the night before anyone could react, his screams continuing for 30 seconds that felt like 30 hours. Each cry rising in pitch and desperation until they stopped abruptly, and the night was silent except for the breathing of the survivors and the sound of something feeding in the darkness, wet tearing sounds and the cracking of bone that needed no translation. And Sarah knew they were listening to Ben being consumed, piece by piece, alive until the end. It stood 8 feet tall at least, perhaps taller, its body covered in shaggy fur that ranged from reddish-brown to black, its shoulders so broad they seemed to span the width of the path, its arms hanging to its knees with hands that could have wrapped around her waist, fingers ending in claws like black daggers that glistened wetly in the starlight. But it was the face that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The face that was almost human but wrong in every way that mattered, the flat broad nose flaring as it scented her fear, the deep-set eyes burning with an intelligence that was ancient and cruel, glowing amber like hot coals in the darkness. And the mouth, oh God, the mouth, opened in a grin that revealed canines the size of her thumbs, yellowed fangs designed for tearing flesh. The teeth of a predator that had never known dental care, that had grown wild and sharp through decades of tearing raw meat, and she saw the blood on its muzzle, Ben Harris's blood, still fresh, still wet, and knew that she was about to die, that this thing would tear her apart as it had torn apart the others, would open her up and consume her while she still breathed. And she closed her eyes and waited for the end, her bladder releasing in terror, the hot shame of it mixing with the cold earth beneath her, her mind retreating to some primal place where thought ceased and only fear remained, the kind of fear that animals feel in the moment before the killing bite, the fear that knows there is no escape, no negotiation, no mercy, only teeth and claws and the end of everything. But the killing blow did not come, and when she opened her eyes, the creature was gone, vanished into the darkness as silently as it had come, leaving her alone with her terror and her shame and the sound of her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. And she could hear Jake Morrison calling her name from somewhere ahead, his voice desperate and cracking, and she realized she was alive, inexplicably. Impossibly alive, though her ankle was shattered, the bone protruding through the skin in a white spike that gleamed obscenely in the dim light, a wound that she would not remember seeing, would not remember the pain of, trauma burying the memory deep in her subconscious where it would resurface in night terrors for decades to come, haunting her sleep with phantom pain and the sensation of hot breath on her face. Jake reached her and hoisted her onto his shoulder, the survival expert carrying her through the forest with a strength born of adrenaline and terror, his muscles screaming, his lungs burning, but he did not stop, did not pause, did not look back, for he knew that the creature was still there, still watching, still deciding whether to let them go or to end them both, and they reached the vehicles to find that 3 of the 4 had been destroyed. Their tires shredded, their engines torn apart, the metal components twisted and bent as though by hands that knew machinery and hated it, only Richard Blackwood's personal Range Rover remaining intact, the wealthy man already inside with the engine running, his face pressed against the window with an expression of panic that suggested he had been about to leave without them, to abandon them to their fate while saving himself. And Jake threw Sarah into the back seat and climbed in beside her, slamming the door just as something massive hit the side of the vehicle, the impact denting the reinforced steel door and rocking the SUV on its suspension, the force of it throwing them against the far side of the cabin, and Blackwood floored the accelerator, the wheels spinning in the mud before catching and launching them forward into the darkness, the headlights catching glimpses of something running alongside them. Keeping pace with the vehicle at 40 kilometers per hour, 50, 60, a shape that ran on 2 legs with impossible speed, the Yowie matching them mile for mile until finally, mercifully, the creature fell back, its roar of frustration shaking the windows as they broke onto the open road and into the relative safety of the modern world, the sound of its rage following them like a curse as they fled into the night. They did not stop until they reached the emergency services station in Katoomba, 3 hours of driving in silence broken only by Sarah's whimpers of pain and Blackwood's muttered prayers to a God he had not believed in since childhood, his hands shaking on the wheel, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror every few seconds, expecting to see the creature following, and when they finally stumbled from the vehicle, the sun was rising over the mountains, turning the sky pink and gold in a mockery of the darkness they had escaped, the beauty of the dawn an insult to the horror they had witnessed. And Sarah looked back at the forest that had swallowed 9 of their number and knew that she would never return, that some mysteries were meant to remain hidden, that the Yowie was not a creature to be studied but a force to be feared. An ancient guardian of a land that humans had never truly conquered, and that she had survived only because it had allowed it, had spared her for reasons she would never understand, carrying with her the memory of amber eyes and the knowledge that in the deep places of the world there were things that walked upright and wore the shape of man but possessed none of its mercy. Things that hunted not for food but for sport, things that would wait in the shadows until the next foolish humans ventured too far from the safety of their cities, and then they would feed again as they had fed for 10,000 years, and would feed for 10,000 more, the Yowie watching from the tree line with patient hunger, counting the days until the next trespass, the next sacrifice, the next meal. The aftermath of their escape from the Megalong Valley did not bring the closure or safety that the survivors desperately needed, for the nightmare had merely shifted from the physical to the psychological, the trauma of those 3 days in the bush festering in their minds like an open wound that refused to heal, leaking poison into their thoughts and dreams. And Sarah Chen found herself institutionalized within 6 months of their return. Her shattered ankle healed, but her spirit broken, the memories of what she had seen playing in endless loop behind her closed eyelids, the amber eyes and the blood-slicked muzzle haunting her every waking moment, and poisoning her dreams with visions of being hunted through endless forests. The creature always just behind her, always reaching with those massive hands to pull her back into the darkness where she belonged, where she had been marked to go. The official report attributed the deaths of Marcus Webb, Robert Klein, Ben Harris, Paul Hendricks, Jennifer Torres, Dr. Maya Singh, Sofia Rodriguez, David Yaron, and Alina Vasquez to a probable bear attack. Despite the complete absence of bears in Australia, the authorities unwilling to acknowledge the impossible, to document in their files that a 12-foot hairy hominid had systematically murdered 9 people in the Blue Mountains, and Richard Blackwood had used his considerable wealth to bury the investigation, paying off officials and destroying evidence, his exclusive footage of the creature locked in a vault somewhere. Too valuable to release and too dangerous to exist, the man himself retreating to a compound in the Northern Territory where he lived behind walls and guards, never venturing into the wilderness again, his obsession with the Yowie curdled into a terror that consumed him like a cancer. His fortune spent on security measures and psychiatric medications that did nothing to silence the voice in his head that told him it was still out there, still watching, still waiting for him to make the mistake of leaving his fortress, to become vulnerable, to become prey. Jake Morrison had fared better than the others, the survival expert's training and mental discipline allowing him to compartmentalize the trauma, to function in the everyday world while keeping the horror locked in a box deep in his subconscious. But he too was changed. Unable to sleep without heavy curtains and multiple locks, unable to enter any forest without his hand straying to the pistol he carried illegally, the weapon that he knew would be useless against something that moved with the speed and cunning they had witnessed, but which provided the only comfort he could find in a world that had revealed itself to be far more monstrous than he had ever imagined. And he spent his days working private security, his nights drinking himself to unconsciousness, the amber eyes waiting for him whenever he closed his own. The memory of the creature's breath hot on his neck driving him to madness one sip at a time, until he could no longer tell where the alcohol ended and the hallucinations began. The Yowie always just outside his window, always watching, always patient. The story should have ended there, with 3 survivors scattered across the globe, carrying their trauma like scars that would never fade. But fate had other plans. For 18 months after the original expedition, a group of environmental activists established a protest camp in the Megalong Valley, chaining themselves to trees in an attempt to prevent logging operations that threatened the ancient forest, and within 72 hours, they began disappearing one by one, their campsites found abandoned, their equipment scattered, their bodies discovered in the same grotesque positions that Sarah had photographed 2 years earlier, hung in trees like macabre ornaments, their chests hollowed out, their faces frozen in expressions of transcendent terror, and the authorities initially suspected a serial killer, some human monster using the forest as cover for his depravities. But Sarah knew the truth, knew that the Yowie had grown bolder, had developed a taste for human flesh that no other prey could satisfy. And when the families of the dead activists hired her as a consultant, offering her a chance to return to the valley and provide closure for those who had lost loved ones, She accepted despite the protests of her psychiatrist and the terror that clawed at her chest whenever she thought of those amber eyes. Because she understood now that the creature was not merely defending territory but was hunting, actively and intelligently hunting humans. And if something was not done, the deaths would continue, the forest would become a charnel house, and the Yowie would grow ever bolder, ever more skilled at taking its prey from the midst of civilization, learning from each encounter, adapting to human behavior, becoming the perfect predator of mankind. She assembled a new team, not of scientists this time, but of hunters and soldiers, men who had faced death in war zones and come back changed but unbroken, men who understood that the world contained monsters and were willing to face them, men with names like Tors and Chen and Holloway and Morrison, men who carried weapons designed to kill anything that walked or crawled, and they entered the Megalong Valley on a cold winter morning, the mist hanging low over the valley floor like a shroud, the trees dripping with condensation that ran like tears down their bark. And Sarah felt the familiar weight of fear settle over her, the knowledge that she was walking back into the jaws of the beast that had nearly consumed her. But this time she was prepared. This time she had brought weapons that could kill, high-powered rifles with armor-piercing rounds, explosives, thermal imaging equipment, and 6 men who knew how to kill and were not afraid to do so, men who had not yet learned that some things cannot be killed, some things that have existed since before mankind learned to make weapons, things that would still exist long after the last bullet had been fired. They made camp at the same site where the original expedition had been based, the clearing still marked by the rusted remnants of their equipment, the refrigeration unit where Marcus Webb had been stored now a hollow shell, its door torn from its hinges, the interior stained with old blood. And as they set up their defenses, Sarah felt the familiar sensation of being watched, the skin on the back of her neck prickling with awareness, and she scanned the tree line through her binoculars, searching for movement, searching for those telltale patches of reddish-brown fur that would signal the creature's presence. But the forest was still, too still, the silence of a predator waiting for the prey to make the first mistake, the first misstep that would signal the beginning of the end. The first attack came at dusk, the creature demonstrating the intelligence that Sarah had suspected, waiting until the light was fading, and the hunters were struggling to adjust their vision. And it came not from the forest but from above, dropping from the canopy where it had been waiting. Watching, its massive weight crushing Dave Tors, the former Marine, before he could raise his weapon, the creature's hands wrapping around his head and twisting with a motion so smooth and practiced that his neck snapped instantly, the crack of it audible across the camp. His body falling limp as the Yowie turned on Michael Chen, no relation to Sarah, the hunter's rifle firing once, twice, the shots going wide as the creature closed the distance between them with a speed that defied its bulk, one massive hand striking Michael in the chest with enough force to cave in his ribcage, the bones splintering and puncturing his heart and lungs, his death instantaneous, his blood spraying across the camp in a fountain that painted the tents and equipment with crimson, his body falling to the ground with the thud of dead meat. Sarah had seen it then, truly seen it in the dying light, the Yowie in all its terrible glory, and it was larger than she remembered, 10 feet tall at least, its musculature visible even beneath the thick fur that covered its body and its face. That almost human face twisted into a snarl that revealed the full length of its fangs, and it saw her, its amber eyes locking onto hers with a recognition that made her blood run cold, and it roared, not the roar of an animal but something that sounded almost like laughter, like mockery, like the acknowledgement that they had tried to kill it and failed. And then it was gone, disappearing into the forest with the bodies of Tors and Chen, dragging them into the darkness as trophies, as meals, and the remaining hunters opened fire into the tree line, their bullets shredding leaves and bark but finding no flesh, the creature moving with supernatural speed and grace, dodging their fire as though it understood what bullets were and how to avoid them, as though it had learned from previous encounters with humans, had evolved to become the perfect killer. The night that followed was the longest of Sarah's life. The survivors huddled in the center of camp, their backs to the fire, their weapons trained on the darkness that pressed against the circle of light like a physical force, and they heard it moving around them, circling, always circling, the footsteps heavy and deliberate, and the mimicry began again, the voices of their dead companions calling to them from the darkness. Dave Torres begging for help, Michael Chen screaming for his mother, and Sarah understood then that the creature was not merely mimicking sounds but was somehow accessing memories, somehow projecting the voices of the dead to torment the living, and she screamed at the others not to listen, not to believe, that the voices were lies designed to lure them out. But her warnings came too late for James Holloway, the youngest of the hunters, who stood up and walked toward the darkness, his face slack with horror and pity, whispering that he could see his brother, that his brother was calling him, and the others tried to restrain him, to pull him back to the safety of the fire, but he fought them with a strength that seemed supernatural. Breaking free of their grip and running into the night, his screams beginning before he had gone 10 meters, the wet tearing sounds of his evisceration carrying back to camp, and then silence, and then the chewing, the creature feeding on him while they listened, unable to help, unable to look away from the darkness where their companion had just died. Sarah made a decision then, a decision born of desperation and the understanding that they could not survive another night, that the creature was playing with them, wearing them down, and would eventually take them all, and she ordered the survivors to abandon everything but their weapons and move. To run for the vehicles that they had parked 3 kilometers away at the edge of the forest, to make a break for it while the creature was distracted with its meal. And they moved as one, the 4 remaining hunters and Sarah, moving through the forest with their flashlights casting wild shadows. And they ran, their boots pounding the leaf litter, their breath coming in ragged gasps, and behind them they heard it, the pursuit beginning, the heavy footsteps keeping pace with them, gaining on them, and Sarah knew they would not make it, knew that the creature was faster, stronger, and that it was merely extending the chase for its own amusement, and she stopped, turned, raised her rifle, and fired into the darkness, the muzzle flash illuminating the Yowie for a fraction of a second, close enough to touch, and she saw it smile, saw its teeth glisten, and then her rifle clicked empty and the creature was upon her. But instead of the killing blow she expected, it grabbed her, lifted her, its massive hand wrapping around her waist and squeezing until she felt her ribs compress, felt the air forced from her lungs. And it carried her, ran with her through the forest at a speed that made the trees blur, and she realized it was taking her somewhere, that she was not to be killed like the others but was chosen for something else, something worse, and she struggled, beat at its fur with her fists. But it was like hitting stone, the muscle beneath the fur unyielding, and then they stopped, and she saw where they were, a cave, a hidden cave in the side of the escarpment that no human had ever found. And inside, oh God, inside, she saw the remains of dozens, perhaps hundreds. The bones piled in corners, the skulls arranged in patterns, and the smell of death and decay and old blood, and she knew this was its lair, its home, and that she was to become part of this collection, this monument to its hunting prowess, this museum of murder. The creature set her down, gently almost, and backed away, watching her with those terrible, intelligent eyes, and Sarah saw her chance, saw the opening where the cave mouth was, and she ran, her legs pumping, her heart threatening to burst from her chest, and she heard it laugh, a sound like rocks grinding together, and then it was on her again, not to kill but to play. Batting her with those massive hands like a cat plays with a mouse, knocking her sprawling, her shoulder dislocating, her cheekbone cracking, and she crawled, tried to escape, and it let her crawl almost to the entrance before dragging her back by her ankle, her skin tearing against the stone, leaving a trail of blood that glistened black in the dim light. And it picked her up again, held her close, and she smelled its breath, smelled the meat and the blood and something else, something that smelled almost like flowers, like the native beronia that grew in these valleys. And she realized with a clarity that bordered on madness that the creature was not merely a beast but something more. Something that had evolved beyond the need for simple predation. Something that had developed rituals, preferences, perhaps even what could be called culture. And that she was participating in one of these rituals now. The hunt and capture and ultimate sacrifice to whatever gods or forces such a creature might worship. Whatever dark deities demanded blood and fear and suffering. But Sarah was not ready to die, not ready to become another skull in its collection. And as the creature held her close, examining her with a curiosity that seemed almost tender, she found the knife, the hunting knife she kept sheathed at her belt. And with her one good arm she drew it and plunged it into the creature's eye, the blade sinking deep into the socket, the amber light extinguishing in a spray of ichor that was not quite blood, too thick, too dark, and the Yowie screamed, a sound that shook the cave and brought rocks tumbling from the ceiling. And it dropped her, its hands going to its ruined face, and Sarah ran, truly ran, her broken body finding reserves of strength she did not know she possessed. And she burst from the cave into the night, the stars bright above her, and she ran until she could run no more. Collapsing in a dry creek bed, her consciousness fading, her last thought before the blackness took her that she had wounded it, had marked it, had proved that it could be hurt, and that knowledge was her gift to whatever poor souls came after her legacy to the world. The search party found her 3 days later, dehydrated and delirious, her injuries so severe that the doctors said she should have died, and she spent 6 months in hospital, her body healing but her mind fractured beyond repair. And she never spoke of what happened in that cave, never told anyone that she had blinded the Yowie in one eye. Never mentioned the collection of skulls or the intelligence she had witnessed. And when the authorities asked about the other hunters, she told them they had been killed by a bear, the same lie that had been told about the first expedition, and she was believed, for no one wanted to know the truth, no one wanted to accept that such things existed. And she was released eventually, sent home to her empty apartment, her empty life, her memories of amber eyes and the understanding that somewhere in the Megalong Valley, a creature with one good eye was still waiting, still watching, and would wait for as long as it took until the next fool ventured into its domain, for the Yowie was patient. The Yowie was eternal, and the Yowie would always be hungry, always hunting, always watching from the shadows of the ancient forest that had been its home since before humans walked upright, and would rule them long after the last human had turned to dust, the survivors of the second expedition numbering only 3. The hunters who had run while Sarah held the creature's attention, and they never spoke of what they saw, never reported the deaths of their companions, simply melted back into civilian life with a newfound appreciation for walls and locks and the electric lights that kept the darkness at bay, but each of them, in their own way, carried the mark of the Yowie, the knowledge that they had been spared not through their own skill or courage, but through the whim of a creature that could have killed them as easily as breathing. And they lived their lives in shadow, never venturing into wilderness, never camping, never hiking, for they knew that the forest was not empty, that the trees had eyes, that something ancient and terrible walked on 2 legs through the valleys and ridges of the Blue Mountains, and that it remembered them, remembered their scents, their sounds, and would be waiting if they ever dared to return. The Yowie with its single amber eye and its collection of skulls and its endless, patient hunger for the meat that walked on 2 legs and thought itself the master of the world, unaware that it was merely prey, merely livestock, merely food for the thing that had ruled these lands before the first European ship had sighted the southern continent, and would rule them long after the last human had turned to dust. The Yowie was not a legend, not a myth, not a misidentified kangaroo or dingo or bear, but the true inheritor of Australia, the apex predator that had evolved alongside the continent's unique fauna and developed an intelligence that rivaled human cunning. Wrapped in a body of pure destructive power, and it watched from the tree line even now, as you read these words, waiting for the next trespasser, the next researcher, the next curious soul who thinks that the wilderness is safe, who believes that science has explained away all the monsters. And it smiles with those terrible fangs, and it waits, for the forest is deep, and the night is long, and there is always room for one more skull in its collection, always hunger for one more meal, always patience for the hunt that is the only true purpose of its existence. The endless cycle of stalking and killing and feeding that has sustained it for millennia and will sustain it until the stars burn out and the earth turns cold. The Yowie, the hairy man, the monster of the Australian bush, watching, waiting, and always, always hungry for more. The years that followed Sarah's second encounter with the Yowie were years of darkness and isolation, the cryptozoologist retreating from public life, her research abandoned, her theories ridiculed by the same scientific community that had once championed her as a rising star, her photographs of the creature dismissed as elaborate hoaxes, her eyewitness testimony discounted as the ravings of a woman driven mad by trauma and guilt. And she lived alone in a small apartment in Sydney, the windows permanently shuttered, the doors secured with multiple locks, the walls covered in newspaper clippings about disappearances in the Blue Mountains, each one a potential victim, each one a reminder that the Yowie was still out there, still hunting, still feeding on the unwary who ventured into its domain. But the creature had not forgotten her, the one human who had wounded it, the one prey who had escaped its lair, and Sarah began to notice things, small things at first, the sound of heavy footsteps outside her window at night, the smell of wet fur and ancient earth that would drift through her apartment despite the sealed windows. The feeling of being watched even in the most crowded places, the certainty that amber eyes were tracking her movements from the shadows, and she knew that the Yowie had marked her, had chosen her for some final reckoning, some ultimate hunt that would end only when one of them was dead. She received the first package 6 months after her release from the hospital, a crude wooden box left on her doorstep with no return address, no postage, no indication of how it had arrived, and inside, nestled among dried leaves and moss, was a human finger, the nail torn, the skin mottled with decay, and a note written in what looked like dried blood, the symbols unfamiliar but the meaning clear. A message from the creature that had learned to write, or had always known how, a message that said simply soon. And Sarah understood that the Yowie was coming for her, was tormenting her, was enjoying the fear it inspired, and she knew that she had to act, had to find a way to end this, to kill the creature or be killed by it. And she began to plan, to prepare, to turn her apartment into a fortress and her mind into a weapon. She contacted Jake Morrison, the only other survivor who had retained any semblance of sanity, and together they began to research, to study every account of Yowie attacks, every indigenous legend, every piece of folklore that might give them an advantage, and they learned that the creature was not invincible, that it could be hurt, could be killed. Though no human had ever succeeded in doing so, that it had weaknesses, vulnerabilities, things it feared, and they armed themselves with these weapons, with fire and iron, and the ancient curses that David Yaron had written in his journal before he died, and they made plans to return to the Megalong Valley, to hunt the hunter, to end the terror that had consumed both their lives. They entered the forest on the winter solstice, the longest night of the year when the Yowie was said to be strongest, when its power was at its peak, and they found the cave where Sarah had been taken, the entrance hidden behind a curtain of vines, the interior dark and stinking of death, and they set their traps, their explosives, their cameras, and they waited, and they did not wait long. The creature came at midnight, drawn by their presence, by their defiance, by the challenge they represented, and it came with fury, with speed, with a rage that made the ground shake, and Jake died first, his throat torn out before he could fire a single shot, his body falling to the cave floor with the wet sound of meat hitting stone. And Sarah ran, her traps forgotten, her courage failing, and the Yowie pursued her through the forest, its one good eye gleaming with the joy of the hunt. And she ran until she could run no more, until she stood at the edge of a cliff. The valley spread below her like a dark mouth waiting to swallow her, and the creature stood before her, massive and terrible, and it reached for her, and she stepped back and fell. And as she fell, she saw the creature's face, saw the confusion there, the surprise, the disappointment that its prey had escaped it one final time. And then the ground rose to meet her, and there was darkness, and then nothing. The authorities found her body 3 weeks later, at the bottom of a ravine in the Megalong Valley. Her death ruled a suicide, another victim of the madness that had claimed so many who ventured into those woods, and her apartment was cleared out, her possessions sold. Her research destroyed, and the Yowie continued to hunt, continued to kill, continued to wait for the next fool who would venture into its domain. For the forest was old, and the creature was patient, and the hunt would continue until the end of time. Until the last human had been consumed, until the Yowie stood alone in the wilderness, the king of a world it had reclaimed from the pretenders who had thought themselves its masters, and in the silence of the ancient forest, in the darkness between the trees. Something laughed, a sound like rocks grinding together, like death itself amused, and the hunt began anew and would begin again, forever and ever, until the stars burned out and the earth turned cold. The Yowie watching, waiting, and always, always hungry for more. The legacy of those who had faced the Yowie and survived, however briefly, was written in blood and terror, in the nightmares that would never fade, in the knowledge that they had glimpsed something that should not exist, something that defied every law of nature and reason, something that was older than humanity and would outlast it. And they carried this knowledge like a brand, like a wound that would never heal. And they warned others, those who would listen, those who had not yet been consumed by the arrogance of science and reason. And some heeded these warnings and some did not, and the Yowie fed on both with equal hunger, for the creature did not discriminate, did not care for intelligence or wisdom, only for meat and fear and the sweet taste of life extinguished. And in the deep places of the world, in the forests that humans had not yet destroyed, the Yowie walked on 2 legs and waited and watched and smiled with its terrible fangs, and the hunt continued, would always continue, until the end of all things. The final accounting of the Yowie's victims would never be complete, for it had fed for thousands of years before humans learned to write, and would feed for thousands more after the last book was burned, the last record lost, and the only monument to its hunger would be the bones that littered its lair, the skulls that watched with empty eyes, the memory of amber in the darkness, and the fear that it inspired. The primal terror that spoke to something deep in the human soul, the knowledge that we were not the apex, not the masters, not the chosen, but merely prey, merely food, merely temporary visitors in a world that belonged to older and hungrier things. And in the end, when the last human died, the Yowie would still be there in the forest in the dark, waiting for whatever came next. For the hunt was eternal, the hunger was endless, and the Yowie was forever. And so the story ends, not with closure, not with victory, not with the death of the monster and the triumph of humanity, but with the understanding that some monsters cannot be killed, some evils cannot be defeated, some nightmares are not dreams but reality. And the Yowie walks still, in the ancient forests of Australia, in the places where humans fear to go, in the darkness between the trees, and it watches, and it waits, and it hungers. And if you venture into its domain, if you trespass on its territory, if you dare to seek it out, it will find you, and it will take you, and you will become part of its collection, another skull in its cave, another victim in its endless hunt, and your screams will echo through the valleys, and your blood will nourish the earth, and the Yowie will smile with its terrible fangs. And the hunt will continue as it has always continued, as it will always continue, until the stars burn out and the earth turns cold. The Yowie, the hairy man, the monster of the Australian bush, watching, waiting, and always hungry for more. The three survivors of the original expedition, Sarah Chen, Jake Morrison, and Richard Blackwood, had all died within 3 years of their encounter with the Yowie. Sarah by her own hand, or so the authorities claimed, Jake by the creature's claws in their final confrontation, and Blackwood by madness, the wealthy man found dead in his compound, his body torn apart by his own hands, his face frozen in an expression of such terror that the coroner had never seen its like, and the Yowie had claimed them all, one by one, as it had promised, as it had marked them to do, and the only legacy they left was a warning, a story told in whispers, a legend of the hairy man who walks in the bush, who hunts the unwary, who waits for the foolish, and who always claims its due. The forest is deep, the night is dark, and the Yowie is waiting. Do not go into the woods. Do not seek the creature. Do not tempt the ancient hunger that lives in the shadows, for it will find you and it will take you, and you will never be seen again. Only your bones will remain, your skull will watch from its place in the cave, and the Yowie will smile, and the hunt will continue forever and ever until the end of time. This is the truth of the Yowie, the reality behind the legend, the horror that walks on 2 legs in the ancient forests of Australia. And if you value your life, if you cherish your sanity, if you wish to keep your flesh on your bones and your blood in your veins, you will heed this warning. You will stay away from the deep woods, you will never venture into Yowie country, and you will pray that the creature never learns your name, never catches your scent, never marks you for its hunt. For once the Yowie has chosen you, there is no escape, no hiding, no salvation, only the waiting and the fear. And the final moment when amber eyes appear in the darkness, and massive hands reach for you, and the screaming begins, and does not end until you are nothing but meat and memory, another victim of the eternal hunger, another tribute to the Ancient One, another skull in the collection of the Yowie. The monster, the legend, the reality, the eternal hunter of the Australian bush who walks still, who watches still, who waits still, and who will be waiting when you come, as you surely will, for humans are foolish, humans are curious, humans are food, and the Yowie is always hungry. The story of the Yowie did not end with the deaths of those who had faced it, for the creature continued its hunt, continued its slaughter, continued its eternal feast on human flesh and human fear, and new victims fell to its claws with each passing year, each passing decade, each passing century. For the Yowie was immortal, unaging, undying, a force of nature that could not be stopped by time or tide or human intervention. The logging crews who came to the Megalong Valley in the years after Sarah's death were the first to feel the creature's renewed wrath, their heavy machinery and chainsaws awakening something in the ancient forest, something that had been content to hunt only the occasional wanderer, but now found itself threatened by the wholesale destruction of its home, and it responded with a ferocity that shocked even those who had studied its previous attacks. The first crew of 12 men and 2 women arrived in spring, their trucks loaded with equipment, their minds filled with plans and profits, and they established a base camp on the very spot where Sarah's expedition had met its doom, unaware of the history, the blood, the bones that littered the ground beneath their feet, and they began to cut, to clear, to destroy. And on the 3rd night, the Yowie came for them. It came silently, moving through the darkness with the grace of a shadow, and it took them one by one, the first screams waking the others, but the others could not see their attacker, could only hear the wet sounds of tearing flesh and breaking bone, could only smell the blood that filled the air like a mist. And they ran, those who could run, and they died. Those who could not, and by morning, 14 bodies hung in the trees, 14 chests hollowed out, 14 faces frozen in expressions of transcendent terror. And the logging company abandoned the project, wrote off the losses, and never spoke of what had happened, burying the incident under paperwork and insurance claims and non-disclosure agreements. But the Yowie was not satisfied, for the forest was still being destroyed. still being eaten away by human greed, and it began to range farther, to hunt beyond its traditional territory, to take prey from the edges of civilization, from the farms and towns and cities that pressed against the wilderness like a cancer, and the disappearances mounted. The mysterious deaths accumulated, and the authorities scrambled for explanations, for solutions, for anything that would stop the panic that was spreading through the region. And they found nothing, for how do you stop a creature that cannot be seen, cannot be tracked, cannot be killed, a creature that has survived for millennia and will survive for millennia more? The search parties that entered the forest to find the missing loggers were themselves hunted, the Yowie taking them with a glee that suggested sport rather than necessity, playing with them, tormenting them, leading them deeper into the bush with mimicry of voices and sounds, luring them away from safety into the darkness where it could take them at its leisure. And the bodies that were found, when they were found at all, bore the marks of the creature's artistry. The chests opened, the organs removed, the bones arranged in patterns that meant nothing to human eyes but everything to the Yowie's alien intelligence, and the message was clear, had always been clear, that this land was not human land, that this forest was not human forest, that the Yowie was king here, was God here, and that all who entered did so at their own peril, as supplicants to a power they could not comprehend and could not defeat. The military intervention that eventually came was a disaster, a massacre that would be classified and buried so deeply that even the highest levels of government would never know the truth. The soldiers sent in with orders to capture or kill the creature, armed with automatic weapons and night vision and the arrogance of a species that believed itself supreme. And they marched into the forest in formation, confident and strong, and they were slaughtered, every single one of them, their bodies found weeks later. Piled in the cave where Sarah had been taken, their weapons unfired or fired uselessly into the darkness, their faces showing the surprise and terror of men who had encountered something that should not exist, something that moved too fast to track, that hit too hard to survive, that killed with an intelligence that made a mockery of their training and their technology. And the generals who had ordered the mission resigned or died or disappeared, and the file was sealed, and the Yowie continued to hunt, continued to kill, continued to feed. The survivors of the military expedition were few, 3 men who had been separated from the main force and had heard the massacre over their radios, the screams and the gunfire and the sudden silence, and they had run, abandoning their comrades, abandoning their duty. Saving themselves, and they were the only ones to return, the only ones to tell what they had heard, what they knew, and they were not believed, or if believed, were silenced, their testimony dismissed as cowardice, as trauma, as lies, and they lived out their lives in shadow. In fear, in the knowledge that they had escaped death only by abandoning their humanity, and the Yowie marked them, as it marked all who survived, and it took them eventually, one by one in the night in the dark when they thought themselves safe, when they thought themselves forgotten and their deaths were not quick, were not merciful, were drawn out over hours of agony and terror. For the Yowie remembered, the Yowie held grudges. The Yowie was patient in its vengeance, and it collected debts in flesh and blood and screaming. The final tally of the Yowie's victims would never be known, for it had fed for thousands of years before written records existed, and would feed for thousands more after the last record was destroyed, and the only evidence of its existence was the fear, the legends, the stories told around campfires and in whispered warnings, the ancient knowledge of the indigenous peoples who had learned to avoid its territory, to respect its power, to leave offerings and prayers for the dead it had taken. And this knowledge was dismissed by the colonizers who came after, by the scientists and rationalists who demanded proof, evidence, specimen, and they got their proof. They got their evidence, they got their specimen in the form of their own deaths, their own blood, their own bones added to the Yowie's collection. And still they came, still they sought, still they trespassed, for humans are foolish, humans are proud, humans are food, and the Yowie was always hungry. The 3 survivors who lived to tell the tale of the original expedition were dead, but their story lived on, passed from person to person, from generation to generation, growing in the telling, becoming legend, becoming myth, becoming warning, and those who heard it and heeded it lived, and those who heard it and scoffed at it died, and the Yowie fed, and the forest remained, ancient and dark and full of teeth. And the creature waited and watched and smiled with its terrible fangs, and the hunt continued as it had always continued, as it would always continue until the end of all things, until the stars burned out and the earth turned cold. The Yowie, the hairy man, the monster, the legend, the reality, the eternal hunter of the Australian bush, watching, waiting, and always, always hungry for more. This is the end, but it is not the end, for the Yowie does not end, cannot end, will not end, and somewhere in the deep forest, in the ancient valley, in the place where humans fear to go, the creature walks on two legs, and it hunts, and it kills, and it feeds, and it waits for you. Yes, you, the one reading these words, the one who thinks this is just a story, just fiction, just entertainment. And it knows you are thinking this, knows you are dismissing the warning, knows you will forget these words the moment you turn the page. And it smiles, for it has always known, has always watched, has always waited, and it is patient, so patient. And it has all the time in the world, all the time in the universe, and it will be here when you come, when you venture into the woods, when you trespass on its territory. And it will take you, and it will feed on you, and you will become part of its story, part of its legend, part of its collection, and your screams will join the chorus of the damned. And your blood will nourish the ancient earth, and the Yowie will be satisfied for a time until the hunger returns, until the next fool comes, until the next victim walks into the forest, and then it will hunt again and kill again, and feed again forever and ever until the end of time, until the last human has been consumed, until the Yowie stands alone in the wilderness, the king of a dead world, the apex of nothing, the hunter with no prey. And even then, even in that final darkness, it will remember, it will dream, it will hunger, for the Yowie is eternal, the Yowie is forever, the Yowie is waiting, and it is waiting for you. The years continued to pass, and the legend of the Yowie grew, spreading beyond Australia, beyond the southern hemisphere, beyond the boundaries of the known world, carried by travelers and traders and the endless march of human migration. And everywhere it went, it found fertile ground. For every culture has its monsters, its boogeymen, its things that go bump in the night, and the Yowie fit perfectly into this pantheon of terror. The hairy man who walks in the forest, the creature that hunts on two legs, the ancient predator that remembers when humans were just another source of meat. In the remote villages of Papua New Guinea, they spoke of the Mokluman, the demon of the mountains, and though the name was different, the description was the same. The towering height, the shaggy fur, the glowing eyes, the taste for human flesh, and the hunters who went into the high forests knew to be careful, knew to make offerings, knew to retreat if they heard the mimicry. The false voices that promised safety but delivered death, and those who did not heed these warnings, those who thought themselves brave or clever or immune to ancient superstition, they disappeared. And their bodies were found, if found at all, torn apart and hollowed out, their chests emptied of organs, their faces frozen in the same expressions of terror that had marked the victims in the Megalong Valley thousands of miles away. The anthropologists who studied these legends dismissed them as cultural diffusion, as the spreading of stories from one people to another, but the Yowie knew better. The Yowie understood that it was not bound by geography, not limited by distance, that it could travel where it wished when it wished, that it could be in Australia one night and New Guinea the next, in the Americas the following week. For it was not a creature of flesh and blood, not merely, but something more, something that existed in the spaces between worlds, that walked in the shadows that humans feared to look at, that hunted in the corners of the eye where reality grew thin and the impossible became possible. And its range was the range of fear itself, the range of the unknown, the range of the dark places where humans did not go. The 3 survivors who had lived through the original expedition were dead, their stories buried with them, but new survivors emerged, new witnesses who had seen the creature and lived to tell the tale, though telling the tale often meant being dismissed as mad, as deluded, as victims of hallucination or hoax, and they carried their knowledge in silence, in fear, in the sure knowledge that the Yowie was still watching, still waiting, still marking them for the day when it would come to collect its due. The hikers who vanished from the trails of the Pacific Crest Trail in California, their bodies found mutilated in ways that baffled forensic pathologists, their chests hollowed, their organs removed, their deaths attributed to bears or mountain lions or serial killers. But the survivors, the ones who had seen the creature, they knew. They recognized the patterns, the signatures, the artistry of a predator that had been practicing its craft for millennia, and they whispered of the Yowie, the Sasquatch, the Bigfoot, names for the same thing, the same hunger, the same ancient evil that walked on two legs and hunted humans with an intelligence that made a mockery of all their defenses. The researchers who studied the Himalayan Yeti, the Alma of Mongolia, the Urin of China, they all found the same patterns, the same descriptions, the same impossibility of a giant hominid living undetected in the modern world. And they were right. It was impossible. It should have been impossible. But the Yowie did not care about possibility, did not care about the laws of nature or the limits of science. It simply was, simply hunted, simply fed, and those who sought it found it, or it found them. And the outcome was always the same, always blood, always screaming, always death. The final story of the Yowie has not yet been written, for the creature still walks, still hunts, still waits in the ancient forests and the remote mountains and the deep places where humans have not yet destroyed, and it will continue to walk, to hunt, to wait, until the last human has been consumed, until the last forest has been cut, until the last shadow has been banished by electric light. And even then, even in that impossible future, it will find a way, will adapt, will survive. For the Yowie is eternal, unkillable, unstoppable, the apex predator of a world that has forgotten what it means to be prey. And it teaches that lesson still, every night, every hunt, every kill, to those who venture into its domain, to those who trespass on its territory, to those who think themselves safe in their cities and their walls and their technology. For the Yowie is patient, is cunning, is eternal, and it will be here when the cities fall, when the walls crumble, when the technology fails, and it will hunt again and feed again, and teach again the lesson that humans most need to learn. That they are not the masters of this world, not the apex, not the chosen, but merely food for the ancient hunger that walks on two legs in the darkness, that watches with amber eyes, that smiles with terrible fangs, that waits, always waits for the next victim, the next meal, the next sacrifice to the eternal hunt. The Piasa Bird versus the Thunderbird. Chapter 1: The River Town. The town of River Bluff had existed in the shadow of the limestone cliffs for nearly 2 centuries, a sleepy community nestled along the Mississippi River, where the water ran deep and dark, carrying with it the sediment and secrets of 1,000 miles of heartland. Founded by French fur traders in the early 1800s, the settlement had grown into a modest municipality of 12,000 souls, most of whom made their living from the river itself. Fishermen, barge operators, tour guides who led visitors to see the replica Piasa bird painted on the bluffs above the town. The original pictographs had long since faded, erased by time and weather and the carelessness of progress, but the legend remained, etched into the cultural memory of the region like the limestone itself. Dr. Sarah Chen stood on the observation deck near the base of the bluffs, her eyes fixed on the replica painting that adorned the rock face 50 feet above her. The Piasa bird stared back at her with its terrible visage, dragon-like body, antlered head, scaled wings, and a gaping maw filled with teeth that seemed designed for tearing flesh from bone. The painting was a recreation, of course, based on Father Marquette's descriptions from 1673, but something about it felt authentic in a way that unnerved her. As a professor of folklore and cryptozoology at Southern Illinois University, Sarah had spent 15 years studying regional legends, and she had developed what her colleagues called an intuitive sense for when stories held more than metaphorical truth. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, turning the Mississippi into a ribbon of molten copper that stretched toward the horizon. Sarah wiped sweat from her forehead and checked her watch. 3:47 p.m. She was waiting for her research assistant, Marcus Webb, who was supposed to have arrived with the new ground-penetrating radar equipment 30 minutes ago. They were scheduled to begin a comprehensive survey of the bluffs tomorrow morning, searching for evidence of the original painting's location and any archaeological remains that might shed light on the true origins of the Piasa legend. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she pulled it out to see a text from Marcus. Running late. Equipment rental place had issues. Be there in 20. Sarah sighed and typed a quick acknowledgement. She had learned long ago that fieldwork rarely proceeded according to schedule, especially when dealing with small-town equipment suppliers who didn't understand the urgency of academic deadlines. As she pocketed her phone, Sarah felt a sudden chill despite the August heat. The hair on the back of her neck stood up, and she turned slowly, her eyes scanning the river's surface. For a moment she thought she saw something moving beneath the water, a dark shape, impossibly large, gliding against the current. She blinked and it was gone. Probably just a shadow, she told herself, or a submerged log carried by the river's powerful flow. But her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her water bottle. The river had always had a strange quality to it, something that the locals spoke of in hushed tones when outsiders weren't around. Old-timers would tell stories about the river spirits that demanded tribute, about the strange disappearances that had plagued the region for as long as anyone could remember. Sarah had dismissed these tales as superstition, the kind of folklore that grew naturally around any large body of water that claimed lives on a regular basis. But standing there alone at the base of the bluffs, with the Piasa Bird's painted eyes seeming to follow her movements, she felt a prickle of genuine fear. Marcus arrived 25 minutes later, his battered pickup truck rattling into the parking lot with the GPR equipment secured in the bed under a tarp. He was a graduate student in his late 20s, built like a linebacker but with the gentle demeanor of a librarian. "Sorry about the delay, Dr. Chen," he said as he hopped down from the cab. The rental guy wanted to argue about insurance coverage for unusual usage scenarios. Apparently, scanning limestone bluffs for ancient pictographs counts as unusual. Sarah smiled despite her earlier unease. Small-town bureaucracy at its finest. Let's get this unloaded and do a preliminary setup. I want to be ready to start at dawn tomorrow. Together they wrestled the GPR unit from the truck, a heavy, cumbersome device that looked like a lawnmower mated with a satellite dish. As they worked, Sarah noticed that Marcus kept glancing at the river, his expression troubled. "Something wrong?" she asked. "Probably nothing," Marcus said, hesitating, "but have you noticed how quiet it is?" Sarah paused and listened. He was right. The river should have been alive with sound, waterfowl, the splash of fish, the eternal murmur of the current against the shore. Instead, an unnatural silence had settled over the area. Even the insects had stopped their droning. The only sound was the whisper of wind through the dried grass along the riverbank. "That's strange," Sarah admitted. "Maybe a storm's coming." Marcus shook his head. "Sky's clear, and look at the birds." He pointed toward the tree line, and Sarah saw what he meant. Thousands of birds, starlings, sparrows, finches, even large crows, were streaming away from the river in a continuous flow, their flight panicked and erratic. They flew without calling, without the usual cacophony of a flock in motion. Just silent, desperate escape. "Something scared them," Marcus said quietly. "Something big." Before Sarah could respond, a sound rolled across the water, not thunder, though it was deep and resonant like thunder, but sharper, more percussive. It was a crack that seemed to originate from the very air itself, followed by a rumbling that vibrated in Sarah's chest and set her teeth on edge. The sky above remained cloudless and blue, but the temperature dropped suddenly, as if someone had opened a door into an ice house. "We should get inside," Sarah said, her voice steadier than she felt. "That sounded like—" She never finished the sentence. From somewhere high above, impossibly high, came a sound that no human throat could produce. It was a cry, but not like any bird call Sarah had ever heard. It was the sound of lightning made vocal, the scream of a storm given form and intent. It shook the ground beneath her feet and echoed off the limestone bluffs with such force that small rocks dislodged and tumbled down the rock face, bouncing and clattering into the river below. Marcus dropped the GPR equipment and grabbed Sarah's arm. "Dr. Chen, we need to run, now." They ran. Chapter 2: Ancient Echoes. The town of River Bluff had no emergency broadcast system capable of conveying what was happening, no protocols for dealing with the impossible. When the sky began to tear itself apart 3 hours after Sarah and Marcus fled the riverbank, the residents did what humans have always done in the face of the incomprehensible. They panicked, they prayed, and they died. Sarah had driven them back to her rented cottage on the outskirts of town, a quaint 19th-century house with whitewashed walls and a wraparound porch that looked like something from a postcard. Inside, she had spent the last hour trying to contact authorities, local police, county sheriff, state emergency management, only to find all lines jammed with calls. The television showed only static, and the radio emitted nothing but a continuous screech that hurt her ears. "It's happening again," Marcus said. He sat on the couch, his laptop open, scrolling through local historical archives with shaking hands. "Look at this. Newspaper reports from 1847, 1903, 1921. Massive bird sightings, livestock disappearing, people vanishing from riverboats. The articles always mention a storm that came from nowhere and a sound like the heavens breaking." Sarah peered at the screen, reading the faded text of a 100-year-old article. "But these were isolated incidents," she said. "Whatever happened, it passed quickly. Nothing like—" She gestured toward the window, where the sky had turned an unnatural purple-black color, roiling with clouds that moved against the wind. "Maybe it was never fully awake before," Marcus said. "Maybe someone finally did something to trigger it." "Like what?" Marcus pulled up another document, an archaeological survey from 2019 that Sarah hadn't seen before. A construction crew was working on the bluffs last week, blasting for a new resort development. They hit something. Hollow space. The project was shut down by environmental concerns, but look at the photos. The images showed a cavern entrance, narrow but deep, leading into the limestone. And on the walls, barely visible in the camera flash, were markings, ancient, weathered but unmistakably deliberate. Pictographs of a creature that combined features of bird and reptile, of predator and god. "They woke it up," Sarah whispered, "or they broke whatever was keeping it contained." Another sound rolled over the town, this one different from the first. Where the Thunderbird's cry had been electrical and elemental, this was organic, wet, rasping, hungry. It came from the river, and with it came a smell like rotting fish and ancient decay, the odor of something that had lain dormant in deep water for centuries. Sarah rushed to the window and looked out toward the river, though the bluffs blocked her view of the water itself. What she saw in the sky made her knees buckle. It was a bird, but no bird that had ever flown in the modern world. Its wings spanned what must have been 40 feet, black as storm clouds, with edges that crackled with static electricity. Its head was eagle-like but wrong somehow, too large with eyes that glowed with internal fire. Behind it, the sky convulsed with actual lightning, though the storm remained dry. No rain fell, only the terrible electrical display that illuminated the creature as it wheeled and screamed above the town. "The Thunderbird," Marcus breathed, coming to stand beside her. "It's real, it's actually real." "But where's the Piasa?" Sarah asked. "If the Thunderbird is here, the Piasa must be." The river answered her question. From beyond the bluffs came a sound like rushing water but deeper, heavier. A sound like a waterfall in reverse, like something massive displacing tons of liquid with its movement. The ground shook, not from the Thunderbird's presence, but from below, from the river itself. "It's coming ashore," Sarah said. "Both of them, they're coming." The cottage's windows shattered inward as a pressure wave struck the building. Sarah threw herself to the floor, covering her head as glass rained down around her. When she dared to look up, she saw the Thunderbird descending toward the town center, its talons extended, each one longer than a human forearm and curved like scythes. But the Thunderbird wasn't alone in its descent. From the river, rising above the bluffs with a terrible grace, came the Piasa Bird. It was worse than the painting, worse than any description in the historical records. The creature was reptilian and avian in equal measure, its body covered in scales that shimmered with colors Sarah had no names for, colors that seemed to exist outside normal spectrum, that hurt the eyes to look at directly. Its head was draconic, with antler-like horns that twisted and branched like corrupted trees. The wings were leathery, not feathered, and when they spread, they cast a shadow that blotted out the sun. Most terrible were the eyes, intelligent, ancient, filled with a malevolence that transcended mere hunger. The Piasa Bird had been worshipped once, Sarah remembered from her research. Worshipped and feared. The tribes had left offerings on the bluffs, food, valuables, sometimes people. Anything to appease the creature that ruled the river and demanded tribute. The Thunderbird saw its rival and screamed. The Piasa answered with a roar that sounded like grinding stones. And then they collided. Chapter 3: First Blood. The collision of the two titans sent a shockwave through the atmosphere that flattened trees and shattered windows for miles around. Sarah felt it in her bones, a vibration that seemed to scramble her nervous system, leaving her momentarily paralyzed on the cottage floor. When her body finally responded to her commands, she crawled to the window frame and looked out, unable to tear her eyes away from the horror unfolding above River Bluff. The Thunderbird and the Piasa had locked together in midair, talons and claws tearing at each other's flesh with such violence that blood rained down on the town below. Black blood from the Thunderbird that smoked when it hit the ground, and green ichor from the Piasa that seemed to move with purpose, writhing like worms before evaporating into noxious vapor. The Thunderbird's beak struck at the Piasa's eyes, but the dragon creature twisted its serpentine neck and caught the attack on its antlered crown. With a whip-like motion, it threw the Thunderbird sideways, sending the Stormbird crashing into the old water tower on the edge of town. The tower exploded in a shower of rusted metal and concrete, and water gushed forth in a flood that swept away 3 houses before dissipating. But the Thunderbird was far from defeated. It emerged from the wreckage with lightning dancing across its feathers, and when it opened its beak, it didn't scream, it discharged. A bolt of pure energy, brighter than the sun and hot enough to ignite the air itself, lanced toward the Piasa. The dragon creature tried to dodge, but the lightning was too fast, too accurate. It struck the Piasa's left wing, and the smell of burning flesh filled the air, sickening and sweet. The Piasa shrieked and fell, crashing into the river with a splash that sent a tidal wave surging up the banks and into the town. Sarah watched the water rush toward her cottage, carrying debris and worse things. She saw what looked like a cow, bloated and lifeless, spinning in the current, and then a human body, arms outstretched, face frozen in a scream that death had interrupted. "Upstairs," Marcus shouted, pulling at her arm. "We need to get higher." They scrambled up the stairs as the floodwaters reached the first floor, pouring through the broken windows with greedy force. The cottage groaned and shifted on its foundation, but held for now. From the second-floor bedroom window, Sarah had a clearer view of the battle. The Piasa had emerged from the river, its wounded wing trailing smoke, and it had taken to the air again, slower now but no less terrifying. The Thunderbird circled above, gathering another charge, its form limned with crackling electricity. But the creatures weren't just fighting each other anymore. They had noticed the town, the thousands of warm bodies huddled in terror below them. And to creatures of their nature, the town represented something else entirely: territory, resources, and above all, prey. The Thunderbird dove first. It swept low over Main Street, its talons extended, and snatched a car from the road, a compact sedan with someone still inside. Sarah couldn't hear the screams from this distance, but she saw the car rise into the air, saw the door burst open, saw the figure inside try to climb out before the Thunderbird's beak descended and tore them from the vehicle. The body fell, turning end over end, and disappeared into the floodwaters below. The Thunderbird released the empty car, which plummeted back to earth and crushed a parked truck in an explosion of metal and glass. The Piasa took a different approach. It landed on the roof of the First National Bank, its claws punching through the reinforced concrete like paper. It lowered its head and seemed to sniff the air, its forked tongue flickering in and out. Then, with terrifying precision, it struck at a nearby building, the Riverbluff Diner, where Sarah had eaten breakfast that very morning. The creature didn't just break through the walls. It unhinged its jaw, opening its mouth wider than seemed physically possible, wider than its own head, and it began to swallow the building whole. Sarah watched in numb horror as the Piasa's throat bulged with the mass of the structure, as it chewed and swallowed bricks and mortar, and the screaming people inside with equal indifference. The sounds carried even to her distant vantage point: the crunch of bones, the wet tearing of flesh, the final silence. "Oh God," Marcus whispered. "Oh God, oh God, oh God." The Thunderbird had seen its rival feeding, and apparently decided that it too would claim some of the town's bounty. It stooped again, this time targeting the crowd of survivors who had gathered in the town square, presumably thinking that open space offered some safety. They were wrong. The bird's passage created a vortex of wind that lifted people off their feet, spinning them like leaves in a hurricane. Some were dashed against buildings hard enough to paint the walls red. Others were snatched by the Thunderbird's talons, and the bird didn't kill them immediately. It carried them aloft, higher and higher, until they were tiny specks against the dark sky. Then, one by one, it released them. Sarah watched them fall. She counted 7 before she had to look away, 7 bodies tumbling through the air, growing larger and larger until they hit the ground with sounds like overripe melons dropped from a great height. "We have to move," she said, her voice strange and distant in her own ears. "We can't stay here. This cottage won't survive another hit." "Where do we go?" Marcus asked. "They're everywhere, the whole town." He was interrupted by a new sound from the river, not from the creatures, but from the water itself. Something was moving beneath the surface, something massive, creating a wake that pushed the floodwaters higher and higher. "What now?" Sarah asked, but even as she spoke, she knew. The stories had never mentioned just one Piasa bird. The legend spoke of a creature, singular, but the pictographs showed something else: multiple figures, a family, a colony. The water parted, and a second Piasa emerged. This one was smaller than the first, barely 30 feet from nose to tail, but it moved with a speed and agility that the larger creature lacked. It was younger, hungrier, and it had found the cottage. Sarah saw it turn its head toward their building, saw its eyes fix on the second-floor window where she and Marcus stood frozen in terror. The creature's lips pulled back in something that might have been a smile, revealing rows of needle teeth that dripped with river water and blood. "Run!" Sarah screamed, grabbing Marcus's arm. They didn't make it to the stairs. The younger Piasa struck the cottage with the force of a wrecking ball, its head punching through the bedroom wall, splinters and plaster exploding inward. Sarah was thrown backward, hitting the closet door hard enough to drive the air from her lungs. She saw Marcus scramble away from the creature's snapping jaws, saw him reach the top of the stairs. "Jump," he shouted. "The water's deep enough, jump." Sarah didn't question him. She ran for the window on the far side of the room, away from the Piasa's thrashing head, and threw herself through the glass. For a terrible moment she was falling, the air rushing past her, the flood waters rising up to meet her. Then she hit the surface and plunged deep, the shock of the cold water driving away the last of her breath. She kicked and flailed, disoriented, unable to tell which way was up. Her lungs burned, demanding air, but something was wrapped around her leg, cloth from her clothes, debris, she couldn't tell. She kicked harder, clawing at the water, and then her head broke the surface and she gasped, sucking in air that smelled of death and electricity. The cottage was already half collapsed, the Piasa's body coiled around it like a python constricting its prey. Sarah looked for Marcus, scanning the water, the shore, the wreckage. She saw movement on the roof. He had made it out the window but hadn't jumped. He was clinging to the peak of the cottage, the only part still above water, as the creature below him prepared to strike again. "Marcus!" she screamed, but her voice was lost in the cacophony of battle. The Thunderbird had returned, drawn by the commotion, and it dove at the younger Piasa with murderous intent. The dragon creature released the cottage to defend itself, rearing up and spreading its wings in a threat display that would have been comical if it weren't so terrifying. The Thunderbird didn't slow. It struck the Piasa in the chest, driving it backward into the river, and both creatures disappeared beneath the churning surface in a tangle of wings and claws. Marcus used the opportunity to slide down the roof and drop into the water near Sarah. He surfaced coughing, blood running from a gash on his forehead. "The church," he gasped. "St. Mary's. It's on high ground, reinforced construction. We can hold there." "What about the others?" Sarah asked, looking around at the devastation. She could see other survivors now, scattered among the wreckage, some swimming, some clinging to debris, many not moving at all. "We can't just leave them." "We can't save them if we're dead," Marcus said grimly. "Come on." They swam for shore, fighting the current, dodging floating wreckage and worse things. Twice Sarah felt something brush past her legs in the water, something large and smooth, and she swam faster, refusing to think about what might be lurking in the flooded streets below the surface. They reached dry ground, relatively speaking, on what had been Riverside Avenue, now a river itself. The water was only knee-deep here, flowing toward the Mississippi with deceptive gentleness. They stumbled forward, helping each other stay upright, their clothes heavy with water and filth. Behind them, the battle continued. The Thunderbird and the younger Piasa had resurfaced, locked in combat that shredded the remaining buildings along the waterfront. The older Piasa had retreated to the bluffs, its wounded wing making flight difficult, and it roared defiance at the sky, challenging any who would approach its territory. "This is insane," Sarah panted as they climbed the slope toward St. Mary's Church. "This can't be happening. These things aren't supposed to exist." "They exist," Marcus said, "and they're going to kill every person in this town unless someone stops them." How do you stop something like that?" Marcus didn't answer. They had reached the church steps and the doors were already open, survivors streaming inside. An old priest stood in the doorway, his robe soaked, his face pale with shock but his voice steady as he directed people inward. "Come, my children," he called. "Inside quickly. The walls are thick, the foundations are stone. We will be safe here." Sarah wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that faith and architecture could protect them from the nightmare outside. But as she looked back at the destruction of River Bluff, at the two monsters tearing her town apart while a third screamed from the bluffs, she knew that nowhere was safe anymore. The War of the Titans had begun, and humanity was caught in the crossfire. Chapter 4: Wings of Thunder. St. Mary's Church had been built in 1887 by Irish immigrants who had survived their own centuries of persecution and catastrophe, and they had constructed it to endure. The walls were 2 feet thick, solid limestone quarried from the same bluffs that now harbored the Piasa. The foundation extended 15 feet into bedrock, anchored against the Mississippi's periodic floods. The roof was slate, heavy and fire-resistant, supported by oak beams that had cured for a century before being cut. It was, Sarah realized as she huddled in a pew with 30 other survivors, the closest thing to a fortress that River Bluff could offer. The church had no basement. The water table was too high, so everyone crowded into the nave and sanctuary. The priest, Father O'Malley, moved among them offering comfort and practical advice, directing the able-bodied to block the windows with hymnals and communion trays, organizing teams to collect water from the flooded streets while it was still reasonably clean. Sarah counted the survivors as they came in. By her reckoning, there were 43 people in the church now, with more arriving sporadically as the battle outside shifted and created windows of opportunity. She recognized some faces from her weeks in town: the librarian, Mrs. Henderson, the hardware store owner, Mr. Kowalski, a teenage girl named Jenny who worked at the coffee shop. Others were strangers, tourists or transients caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. Marcus had found a first aid kit and was tending to the wounded. Sarah joined him, helping bandage cuts and set broken bones. The injuries were already overwhelming their limited supplies: compound fractures from building collapses, deep lacerations from flying debris, burns from the Thunderbird's electrical discharges. One man had been struck by lightning that arced from the creature's passage. His clothes were fused to his skin, and he screamed continuously until Father O'Malley administered morphine from the church's emergency kit. "How many do you think are dead?" Sarah asked Marcus quietly. He didn't look up from wrapping a woman's shattered forearm. "The town's population is about 12,000, I'd say. At least a third are gone already, maybe more." "Jesus. If he's up there, he's not answering his phone today." A scream from outside cut through their conversation. The church's thick walls muffled most sounds, but this one penetrated: a woman's voice, rising to an impossible pitch before cutting off abruptly. Sarah ran to a boarded window and peered through a gap between the hymnals. The Thunderbird was circling the church. It flew slowly, methodically, its enormous wings creating gusts that shook the building's very foundations. Lightning danced along its wingtips, crackling and sparking against the wet air, and it was looking down, its burning eyes scanning the ground with predatory focus. "It's hunting," Sarah whispered. "It's looking for survivors." "It can't get in here," Marcus said, but he didn't sound convinced. The Thunderbird banked sharply and dove. For a terrible moment, Sarah thought it was attacking the church, but its target was elsewhere: a group of survivors who had been running toward the building from a collapsed house 2 blocks away. There were 6 of them, a family by the looks of it, 2 adults, 4 children of various ages. The Thunderbird struck like a falcon taking a pigeon. Its talons closed around the father, lifting him screaming into the air while the rest of the family scattered. But the creature wasn't satisfied with one victim. It released the man, dropping him from 40 feet to splatter on the pavement, and wheeled around for the others. The mother grabbed 2 of her children and ran, but the youngest, a boy of maybe 5, stumbled and fell. The Thunderbird descended, not with talons this time but with its beak. It plucked the child from the ground with surgical precision, tossed him into the air and caught him again, swallowing him whole in one horrific gulp. The mother saw it happen. Sarah saw her see it, saw her face transform into something beyond grief, beyond madness. The woman charged at the Thunderbird, screaming curses, beating at its legs with her bare hands. The creature regarded her with what looked almost like curiosity, then casually raked her with one talon, opening her from throat to groin. She fell in pieces, and the Thunderbird fed on what remained. "Don't watch," Marcus said, pulling Sarah away from the window. "Don't give it the satisfaction." "It doesn't care if we watch," Sarah said, her voice hollow. "It's not doing this for an audience. It's doing this because it's hungry and we're food." The church doors burst open, and the remaining survivors of that family stumbled in. The father had survived somehow, though he was missing his left arm below the elbow, and the 2 children he carried were catatonic with shock. They collapsed onto the floor, and the other survivors rushed to help them. "It's out there," the father gasped, his face pale from blood loss. "It's everywhere. The bird, the dragon, they're hunting us. They're not just fighting each other anymore. They're hunting us." "We know," Father O'Malley said, pressing cloth against the man's stump. "Try to stay calm. We'll get you help." "Help?" the man laughed, hysterical. "There is no help. The National Guard, the Army, they're all dead. I saw the helicopters go down. The creatures, they knocked them out of the sky like flies." Sarah felt ice in her veins. "Helicopters, the military is here." "Was here. 3 Black Hawks came in about an hour ago. The Thunderbird, it flew into them, just flew right through them. The rotors hit it and exploded, and the birds, the helicopters, they spun out and crashed. One hit the high school. The others," he trailed off, his eyes glazing. "The others fell in the river. I heard screaming." So there would be no rescue from outside. No cavalry, no air strikes, no National Guard rolling in to save the day. They were on their own, 43 people in a stone building, facing creatures that had destroyed military hardware designed for war. "Then we save ourselves," Sarah said, surprised by the strength in her own voice. "Father O'Malley, does this church have a bell tower?" "Yes, but..." "How high?" 100 feet, perhaps a bit more." "Can we access the roof from there?" Father O'Malley's eyes widened. "You can't be serious, going up there in this." "I'm not going up there to die, Father. I'm going up there to see. We need to know what we're dealing with, what the terrain looks like, where the creatures are. If we're going to survive this, we need intelligence." Marcus stood up. "I'll go with you." "No. If something happens to me, you're the only other one who knows the research, the legends, the weaknesses these things might have. You stay here, organize the survivors, keep them calm." "Dr. Chen, this is insane." "Probably, but I'm doing it anyway." She made her way to the back of the church, where a narrow staircase led up to the bell tower. Father O'Malley followed, protesting, but ultimately handed her the heavy iron key that unlocked the tower door. "May God protect you," he said. "If he's taking requests," Sarah replied, "tell him we could use some help down here." The stairs were steep and narrow, worn smooth by centuries of feet. Sarah climbed carefully, one hand on the wall, her ears straining for any sound from outside. The battle between the Thunderbird and the Piasas had moved away from the immediate vicinity, but she could still hear their cries echoing across the town, still feel the vibrations when they struck each other or the ground. She reached the bell chamber, a square room open to the elements on all 4 sides through heavy wooden louvers. The great bronze bell hung silent in its frame, inscribed with the names of the immigrants who had donated their savings to cast it. Sarah squeezed past it and found the trapdoor to the roof. The roof was flat, covered in lead sheeting that was slick with rainwater and the residue of whatever the Thunderbird's body discharged. Sarah crawled out on hands and knees, keeping low, and made her way to the edge. The view was apocalyptic. River Bluff was burning. Not everywhere. The rain and floodwaters prevented widespread fire, but enough buildings had been hit by lightning or collateral damage that smoke rose from a dozen points across the town. The Mississippi itself was choked with debris, entire sections of docks and boathouses and boats tangled together in a floating mass of destruction. Bodies drifted in the current, some human, some animal, some unidentifiable. The Thunderbird was visible to the south, perched atop the remains of the town's water treatment plant. It appeared to be resting, grooming its feathers with its beak, but its eyes remained alert, scanning constantly. Lightning still flickered around it, a nimbus of power that kept any other birds at bay. The older Piasa had retreated to the bluffs, coiled around the replica painting as if claiming it as territory. Its wounded wing hung at a wrong angle, but it was still dangerous, still watching. The younger Piasa was nowhere in sight, presumably lurking somewhere in the river. But there was something else. Sarah squinted, trying to make out details in the gathering dusk. Movement on the far side of town, near the industrial district. Figures, human-shaped but wrong somehow, moving in groups. At first she thought they were more survivors, but no, survivors wouldn't be moving toward the creatures, wouldn't be gathering in the open like that. Then she saw what they were carrying. Weapons. Makeshift spears, clubs, a few firearms. And they were chanting, she realized she could hear it now, a rhythmic cadence that carried across the water. Piasa, Piasa, Piasa. They were worshippers. Cultists, perhaps, or simply people who had lost their minds to fear and decided that appeasement was their only hope. They were marching toward the bluffs, toward the dragon creature, offering themselves or others as sacrifice. "Oh no," Sarah whispered. The older Piasa saw them coming. It uncoiled from the painting and spread its wings, not in pain now but in triumph. It knew what they were, these tiny creatures approaching with their pleas and their offerings. It remembered this from centuries past, remembered the taste of worship and the sweet meat of the faithful. It glided down from the bluffs to meet them. Sarah couldn't watch. She turned away, crawling back toward the trapdoor, her stomach churning. But the sounds reached her anyway, the screams, the wet crunching, the roar of satisfaction. The Piasa was feeding, and it was feeding on people who had walked willingly into its maw. She descended the stairs as fast as she dared, her mind racing. The situation was worse than she had thought. The creatures weren't just monsters, they were intelligent, perhaps even cunning. The Piasa had waited centuries for its worshippers to return, and now that they had, it would grow stronger, more confident, more terrible. She burst back into the nave, gasping for breath. Marcus rushed to her side. "What did you see?" "They're not just animals," Sarah panted. "They think. The Piasa, it has worshippers. People are offering themselves to it." "What? That's insane." It's survival instinct twisted into religion. They're hoping if they feed it, it will spare them. Or maybe they just want to belong to something powerful, something that can actually fight the Thunderbird. Father O'Malley had joined them, his face grave. "This has happened before," he said quietly. "In the old days when the Piasa was active, the tribes would offer sacrifices. It was said that those who served the beast would be spared, made into helpers of a sort." "Helpers?" Sarah asked. "There are stories, people who disappeared and returned, changed, stronger, faster, but not quite human anymore. They would lead others to the slaughter like Judas goats." The thought of human servants working for the creatures was almost worse than the creatures themselves. Sarah had studied enough history to know what humans were capable of when they served monsters. The death camps, the killing fields, the endless inventive cruelties of those who traded conscience for survival. "We need a plan," she said. "We can't just sit here and wait for them to come for us. The church is strong, but it's not impregnable. Eventually they'll break through." "What do you suggest?" Marcus asked. "The legends. Both creatures have weaknesses, vulnerabilities. The Piasa can be poisoned. That's how the chief Watogo defeated it according to the stories. Poisoned arrows." "We don't have poisoned arrows," Marcus pointed out. "No, but we might have something better. The Thunderbird is vulnerable to water, specifically to being submerged. The stories say it can't maintain its storm form underwater, that it becomes weak, mortal. So we drown it. How do you drown something that flies?" "We don't drown it, we trick it. We lure it into the river and trap it there." Father O'Malley shook his head. "Even if that were possible, what about the Piasa? They live in the river. You'd be trapping one monster only to feed another." "Unless," Sarah said slowly, "we get them to fight each other." Marcus stared at her. "You want to pit them against each other?" "They're already fighting. We just need to make the fight final, force them into a confrontation where one can actually kill the other." "And how do we do that?" Sarah thought about the worshippers she had seen marching to their deaths. "We offer them something they both want, territory, food, and above all, us." The plan was desperate, insane, almost certainly suicidal. But as the sounds of feeding continued from the bluffs, As the Thunderbird's cry split the sky from its perch atop the treatment plant, Sarah realized they had no other options. They could hide in the church and die when the walls fell, or they could fight and perhaps take the monsters with them. "I need volunteers," she said, turning to the assembled survivors. "People who can move fast, think on their feet, and aren't afraid to die." Silence answered her. Then slowly a teenage boy stood up, the coffee shop worker Jenny's brother Sarah remembered. His name was Tom. "I'll help," he said. "My sister's out there somewhere. If there's a chance to kill these things, I want to take it." Others stood one by one. A middle-aged woman who taught elementary school, a construction worker with a broken arm but fire in his eyes, Father O'Malley himself, his hands steady despite his age. In the end, 12 of them agreed to the plan. 12 against 2 ancient gods of destruction. "We'll need weapons," Sarah said. "Anything sharp, anything heavy, and we'll need bait." "Bait?" Tom asked. "The Thunderbird is drawn to electrical activity. If we can create a big enough charge, it will come to investigate. The Piasa is drawn to sound, to vibration. If we make noise near the river, it will surface. And when they both show up, then we get them to fight. We use ourselves as the prize. Whoever wins gets to eat us, but only if they defeat their rival first." "That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard," Marcus said. "It'll never work." "Do you have a better idea?" He didn't. They spent the next hour preparing. The construction worker, his name was Dave, found lengths of copper wire in the church's basement, remnants of old electrical work. They stripped the insulation and braided the wire into cables that could carry a charge. Someone produced a car battery from the flooded parking lot, miraculously still functional, and they connected the cables to create an improvised lightning rod. For the Piasa, they gathered anything that would make noise: bells from the tower, metal pipes from the plumbing, the church's collection of musical instruments. Father O'Malley even contributed the antique pipe organ, its bellows still functional despite the damp. The plan was simple in theory. They would split into 2 teams. Team Thunderbird, led by Sarah, would take the lightning rod to high ground, the water tower if it still stood, and create an electrical signature that would draw the Stormbird. Team Piasa, led by Marcus, would position themselves near the river and make as much noise as possible, luring the dragon creatures from their lairs. If everything went right, the 2 teams would draw the creatures into a confrontation zone between them. Somewhere the Thunderbird would be forced to fight over water, and the Piasas would be exposed to aerial attack. If everything went wrong, they would all die. "It's time," Sarah said, checking her watch. The sun was setting, painting the destruction in shades of blood and gold. "We move in 5 minutes." The survivors gathered in a circle, holding hands. Father O'Malley led them in prayer, not just Christian but words from older traditions as well: Celtic, Native American, fragments of half-remembered rituals meant to ward off evil. "May the old gods have mercy," he concluded, "for the new ones surely won't." They broke the circle and moved out into the twilight, 12 humans carrying their pathetic weapons, walking into the domain of monsters. Chapter 5: The Piasa Emerges. Marcus led Team Piasa toward the river, his heart hammering against his ribs with every step. He had never been a brave man, not in the way that mattered. He could face academic criticism, could defend unpopular theories, could stand his ground in intellectual debates. But this was different. This was death, not metaphorical but actual, immediate and hungry. His team consisted of 4 others besides himself: Tom, the teenage boy; Mrs. Patterson, the elementary school teacher; Dave, the construction worker; and a silent man named Hector who had lost his entire family in the first hour of the attack and seemed to have nothing left to live for but revenge. They moved through the flooded streets in single file, keeping to the shadows, avoiding open spaces where the Thunderbird might spot them from above. The water was knee-deep and ice-cold, filthy with debris and worse things that Marcus tried not to look at too closely. He kept one hand on the pipe organ's largest pipe, a brass tube 6 feet long that would serve as their noisemaker, and the other hand on the pistol he had found in a flooded police car. 6 bullets. Not enough to kill a monster, but maybe enough to kill himself if it came to that. "We're getting close," Tom whispered. "I can hear the river." Marcus heard it too, the rush and gurgle of fast-moving water. They had reached the waterfront district, or what remained of it. The buildings here were mostly gone, collapsed or swept away by the tidal waves the creatures had created. Only a few structures still stood, skeletal remains of walls and foundations that offered minimal cover. "There," Dave said, pointing. "That foundation. It's high enough to keep us above the worst flooding, and it's got those steel supports. We can tie ourselves off if the water rises." The foundation belonged to what had been a marina office, a low concrete building that had somehow survived the initial destruction. The steel reinforcements Dave had spotted were part of the rebar framework, exposed when the concrete walls crumbled. They could wrap their cables around these, secure themselves against the current. They waded through the water, each step a struggle against the flow. Marcus's feet found the submerged pavement of the old parking lot, then the steps leading up to the foundation. They climbed out of the water and huddled together, shivering in the cooling air. "Set up the pipe," Marcus ordered. "Mrs. Patterson, you have the bells." The teacher nodded, producing a canvas bag filled with the church's smaller hand bells. They would make noise, but not the deep resonance they needed to attract the Piasa from deep water. "We need to get the big bell down here," Marcus said. "The one from the tower." "Impossible," Dave said. "It weighs half a ton. We couldn't move it if we had a truck." "Then we use what we have." Marcus positioned the brass pipe upright, wedging its base into a crack in the concrete. "Everyone grab something metal. When I give the signal, we all hit our instruments as hard and as fast as we can. The vibration will carry through the water." They prepared their makeshift orchestra, the brass pipe, the hand bells, a triangle, even a frying pan that Mrs. Patterson had inexplicably brought. Hector produced a length of chain that he had found, which would make a satisfying clatter when struck. "Remember," Marcus said, "we want the Piasa to surface, but we don't want it to reach us. As soon as we see it, we stop the noise and move to higher ground. The riverbank is 30 feet that way and it's steep. If we can get up there, the creatures will be forced to fight on our terms." "And if we don't make it to the riverbank?" Tom asked. Marcus didn't answer. He raised his hands, counted down from 3, and brought them down together. The noise was cacophonous, painful, each of them hammering at their instruments with desperate strength. The brass pipe rang like a cathedral bell, deep and resonant. The hand bells chimed in chaotic harmony. The triangle's piercing tone cut through the deeper sounds, and Hector's chain rattled with industrial fury. They played for 30 seconds, then stopped listening. Nothing, just the river, the wind, the distant sounds of battle from elsewhere in the town. "Again," Marcus said. They played longer this time, a full minute of frantic percussion. The vibration traveled through the concrete, through the water, into the depths of the Mississippi where something ancient and terrible lay waiting. The response came not as sound but as movement. The water around the foundation began to churn, bubbles rising from deep below, and the temperature dropped abruptly. A smell reached them, rotting vegetation, dead fish, and something else, something musky and reptilian. "It's coming," Dave whispered. They backed away from the water's edge, climbing onto the highest part of the foundation, bracing themselves against the rebar. The churning intensified, and then the surface broke. The younger Piasa emerged. It was just as terrifying as Marcus remembered from the cottage, but worse somehow in the gathering dark. Its scales absorbed the last light of day, making it appear as a silhouette against the water, only the glow of its eyes revealing its true position. It rose slowly, majestically, water streaming from its body in waterfalls that caught the dying light. It was hunting. Marcus could see that in the way it moved its head, scanning the area, tongue flicking. It had learned from earlier encounters, learned that noise meant food. It was cautious now, patient. "Don't move," Marcus breathed. "Nobody move." The Piasa swam closer, its body undulating with serpentine grace. It was 30 feet long from nose to tail, and its wound from the earlier battle with the Thunderbird had healed already, leaving only a scar where lightning had struck. It circled the foundation twice, looking for the source of the noise. Its tail swept through the water, creating waves that lapped against the concrete, soaking the human's feet. "It's going to find us," Mrs. Patterson whimpered. "Not if we're quiet," Marcus hissed. "It's hunting by sound. If we don't make noise, it might not." Hector moved. The silent man, the one who had lost everything, suddenly surged forward with a scream of rage and grief. He charged at the Piasa with his length of chain raised like a whip, striking at the creature's snout with all his strength. "No," Marcus shouted. The chain hit its mark, wrapping around the Piasa's lower jaw. Hector pulled, trying to drag the creature closer, or perhaps trying to climb aboard it. He was insane with grief beyond fear, beyond reason. The Piasa reacted with terrifying speed. Its head snapped forward, jaws unhinging, and it took Hector in one bite. The man's scream was cut off as the creature swallowed him whole, chain and all, barely chewing. "Run," Marcus screamed. "To the riverbank, run." They ran, splashing through the knee-deep water, clawing their way toward the steep embankment that led up to Riverside Avenue. Behind them, the Piasa roared and gave chase, its bulk creating a wake that pushed them forward even as they tried to escape. Mrs. Patterson stumbled, her age and exhaustion catching up with her. Marcus grabbed her arm, hauling her upright, dragging her along. Tom was ahead of them, already at the embankment, finding handholds in the muddy slope. Dave brought up the rear, his broken arm useless but his legs still strong. The Piasa struck. Its head lunged from the water, jaws gaping, and caught Dave's leg. The construction worker screamed as the creature dragged him backward, his fingers scrabbling at the mud. Marcus released Mrs. Patterson and grabbed Dave's hand, pulling with all his strength. "Help me," he shouted. Tom scrambled back down the slope and grabbed Dave's other hand. Together they pulled, but the Piasa was stronger. Dave's body lifted from the water, then his other leg, then his torso. The creature was drawing him in, preparing to swallow him like it had swallowed Hector. Then something strange happened. The Piasa paused, its head cocking as if listening to something. Its grip on Dave loosened slightly, and in that moment of hesitation, Marcus and Tom pulled with desperate strength. Dave came free, minus one leg below the knee. The Piasa had taken it, chewed and swallowed, but Dave was alive, bleeding profusely but alive. "Get him up," Marcus ordered. "Bandage the stump." They dragged Dave to the top of the embankment, to the relative safety of Riverside Avenue. Mrs. Patterson used her belt as a tourniquet, cinching it above Dave's knee while the man screamed and then passed out from shock. Below them, the Piasa was behaving strangely. It had stopped chasing them and was now swimming in tight circles, agitated, its head raised high above the water. It was listening, Marcus realized, listening to something. And then he heard it too, the Thunderbird's cry, distant but approaching fast. Sarah had succeeded. She had drawn the Stormbird. The battle was about to begin. Chapter 6: Innocence Lost. Sarah's team had reached the water tower ruins by a more circuitous route, avoiding the flooded streets by climbing to higher ground and moving through the residential district that overlooked the river valley. There were 5 of them: Sarah herself, Father O'Malley, a young couple named Ray and Linda who had been visiting from Chicago, and an elderly fisherman named Gus who claimed to know every inch of the river and its surroundings. The water tower had been damaged in the Thunderbird's earlier attack, but it still stood, leaning at a precarious angle but stable enough for their purposes. The base was concrete, the tank itself steel, and it offered the highest vantage point in town short of the church steeple. "Set up the lightning rod," Sarah ordered. "Father O'Malley, you and Linda keep watch. Ray, help me with the battery." They worked quickly, attaching the braided copper cables to the tower's metal framework, creating a web of conductive material that would act as an antenna. The car battery was positioned at the base, its terminals connected to the cables through a switch mechanism that Ray had improvised from a kitchen light switch. "This is going to attract every bit of static electricity in the area," Ray said, his hands shaking slightly, "including the Thunderbird." "That's the idea," Sarah said. "We want it to come here. We want it to think there's a rival, another storm creature challenging its territory. And if it decides to kill us instead of investigating, then we die, but at least we'll have accomplished the first part of the plan." Gus climbed partway up the tower, his weathered face scanning the sky. "I see it," he called down. "To the south, it's moving." Sarah looked up and saw it too, a dark shape against the purple sky, winged and terrible. The Thunderbird had abandoned its perch and was circling, rising on thermal currents, its head turning this way, and that as it searched for the source of the electrical disturbance they were creating. "Hit the switch," she ordered. Ray threw the switch. The effect was immediate and terrifying. Sparks jumped between the cables, blue-white arcs of electricity that danced and crackled with malicious energy. The air itself seemed to contract, pressing against Sarah's eardrums, and her hair stood on end from static charge. The Thunderbird saw it, or felt it. It banked sharply and dove, wings tucked, falling like a missile toward their position. "Get down," Sarah screamed. They huddled at the base of the tower as the Thunderbird swept overhead, so close that Sarah could smell ozone and something else, something that reminded her of the aftermath of a forest fire. The creature didn't attack immediately. It circled, suspicious, intelligent enough to recognize a trap when it saw one. But the electrical signature was too tempting. The Thunderbird landed atop the tower with a crash that shook the structure, bending the metal under its weight. It looked down at the humans with burning eyes, and Sarah saw confusion there, and curiosity and hunger. "It's working," she whispered. "It's trying to figure out what we are." "What do we do now?" Linda asked, her voice barely audible. "Now we run. Everyone back to the river. We need to lead it to Marcus and the others." They ran, bursting from cover and sprinting toward the riverbank. The Thunderbird watched them go, and for a moment Sarah thought it might simply let them escape, might be too focused on the electrical anomaly to care about a few fleeing humans. Then it screamed and launched itself in pursuit. The chase was nightmare made manifest. The Thunderbird flew low, its wingtips brushing the rooftops, its talons extended and reaching. Sarah could hear the wind of its passage, feel the vibration of its wing beats in her chest. It was playing with them, she realized, herding them like sheep toward whatever fate it had planned. "Split up," she shouted. "Father O'Malley, take Linda and Gus to the left. Ray, you're with me. It can't chase us all." They divided, Sarah and Ray veering right toward the marina, the others breaking left toward the town center. The Thunderbird hesitated, choosing between the groups, and chose Sarah. Of course it did. She was the one who had summoned it after all. "Keep running," she told Ray. "Don't stop for anything." "I won't leave you." "You'll die with me. Go." He went, sprinting ahead while Sarah deliberately slowed, drawing the creature's attention. She was 50 yards from the river now, could see the embankment where Marcus and his team had been. If she could just reach it, just get close enough to the water. The Thunderbird struck. Not with its talons, but with lightning. A bolt leaped from its beak, striking the pavement at Sarah's feet, and the shock threw her through the air. She landed hard, rolling her body, screaming with pain. Her vision swam, her ears rang, and she could smell her own hair burning. She tried to rise, but her legs wouldn't respond. The Thunderbird landed 20 feet away, folding its wings, regarding her with that terrible alien intelligence. "Come on," Sarah croaked, raising one hand. "Come and get me." The Thunderbird stepped forward, then stopped. Its head turned, sniffing the air, and Sarah saw something change in its demeanor. It had smelled something, or sensed something, that drove all thought of her from its mind. From the river came a roar. The Piasa had surfaced. The two creatures saw each other across the ruined town, and all pretense of hunting ended. This was what they had been waiting for, what they had been building toward since their first encounter. Territory was one thing, food another, but this was war. The Thunderbird launched itself toward the river, forgetting Sarah entirely. She watched it go, tears streaming down her face from smoke and relief, and then she crawled toward the embankment, dragging her useless legs behind her. She found Marcus at the top, tending to Dave's stump, the others huddled around him. They pulled her up the last few feet, and she collapsed against the muddy ground, gasping for breath. "It worked," she said. "They're fighting." Below them, in the gathering dark, the Thunderbird and the younger Piasa collided with a force that shook the earth. Lightning and water, storm and flood, the ancient enemies tearing at each other with elemental fury. The war had truly begun. Chapter 7: Skyborne Carnage. The battle between the Thunderbird and the younger Piasa was unlike anything Sarah had witnessed in her academic career, unlike anything documented in any cryptozoological record. This wasn't animal combat, wasn't even predator rivalry. This was divine warfare, the clash of nature spirits made flesh, and the world itself seemed to recoil from their violence. The Thunderbird struck first, diving from its height and raking the Piasa's back with talons that sparked with electricity. The Piasa roared and twisted, its serpentine body coiling around the Thunderbird's legs, trying to drag the sky creature down into the water where it would be vulnerable. But the Thunderbird was stronger, or perhaps more desperate. It beat its wings with hurricane force, creating a vortex that lifted both creatures into the air. They rose, locked together, spiraling upward in a dance of death that took them higher and higher until they were silhouettes against the darkening sky. Lightning crackled between them, striking the water, the buildings, the ground. Where it hit, things burned. The wet pavement steamed, the flooded streets boiled, and more than one corpse was incinerated where it floated. "We need to move," Marcus said, helping Sarah to her feet. Her legs were recovering from the electrical shock, tingling and weak but functional. "If they come down on top of us." "We need to see," Sarah interrupted. "We need to know which one wins." "Does it matter? Either way, we're dead." "It matters," she insisted. "If the Thunderbird wins, it's wounded, vulnerable. We might have a chance. If the Piasa wins—" She didn't finish the thought. They all knew what happened if the river dweller claimed victory. They retreated to the partial shelter of a collapsed building, finding a vantage point where they could watch without being immediately crushed by falling debris. The others followed, Tom supporting Dave, Mrs. Patterson clutching her makeshift weapon, Ray and Linda having circled back from their escape, and Father O'Malley bringing up the rear with Gus. Above them, the battle reached its climax. The Thunderbird had gained the upper hand, or perhaps upper wing. It had shaken off the Piasa's coils and was now attacking from above, diving and striking, retreating before the dragon creature could retaliate. Each pass opened new wounds in the Piasa's scaled hide, green ichor raining down like toxic rain. But the Piasa was cunning. It had been defeated this way once already, and it had learned. Instead of trying to match the Thunderbird in the air, it dove, plunging back into the Mississippi with a splash that sent another tidal wave rushing up the banks. The Thunderbird followed. It shouldn't have. Every legend Sarah had ever read emphasized the Thunderbird's vulnerability to water, its inability to maintain its storm form when submerged. But rage or bloodlust drove it now, and it plunged after the Piasa, vanishing beneath the churning surface. The river exploded. For 30 seconds, the water boiled with their combat. Geysers erupted as the Thunderbird discharged its lightning into the depths. The Piasa's tail lashed above the surface, then its head, then the Thunderbird's wing. It was impossible to tell who was winning, who was losing, who was dying. Then the water went still. "Oh God," Linda whispered, "they're both." "Wait," Sarah said. The surface broke. The Thunderbird emerged, dragging itself onto the muddy bank with its wings, its body steaming, lightning flickering weakly around its feathers. It was wounded, exhausted, its beak hanging open as it gasped for breath. But it was alive. Behind it, the water turned green. The younger Piasa floated to the surface, belly up, a massive gash in its throat-leaking ichor that spread across the river in an oil slick of death. Its eyes were open but unseeing, its body already beginning to bloat. "One down," Marcus said, "one to go." The Thunderbird heard him. Its head turned, those burning eyes fixing on their position. It tried to rise, to take to the air again, but its wings wouldn't cooperate. The water had done its work, grounding the storm creature, making it mortal. "It's weak," Sarah said. "Now's our chance." "Our chance to do what?" Tom asked. "We don't have weapons that can hurt it." "We have numbers, we have desperation. We have," she looked around, her eyes landing on the flooded street, the debris, the downed power lines that sparked and hissed in the water. "Electricity, the same thing that hurt the Piasa." "It controls electricity," Ray pointed out. "We can't use its own power against it." "No, but we can use the city's power. Those lines are still live, if we can channel them into the water around the creature." "We'll electrocute ourselves along with it," Marcus said. "Not if we're insulated. Rubber, plastic, anything non-conductive." "Where are we going to find?" He stopped, looking at the building they were huddled against. "The car dealership, next block over. New cars with rubber tires, insulated frames." "And keys?" Father O'Malley asked. "The owners are dead or fled." "I can hotwire," Gus said quietly. "Spent 30 years on the river. Learned some things that weren't in the fishing guides." "Then we do it," Sarah decided. "We get vehicles, we use them to push the power lines into the water around the Thunderbird, and we fry the bastard while it's still recovering." It was a desperate plan, likely suicidal, but no one suggested an alternative. They had come this far, sacrificed this much. They would see it through. They moved in pairs, staying low, circling around the block to approach the dealership from the rear. The Thunderbird watched them go, or seemed to. Its head tracked their movement, but it made no move to pursue. It was recovering, Sarah realized, gathering its strength. They had minutes, maybe less. The dealership had been partially destroyed, the showroom collapsed, but the outdoor lot was mostly intact. A dozen vehicles stood in neat rows, their windows shattered but their tires intact. Gus went to work on the nearest, a heavy-duty pickup truck that had the mass they would need. 2 minutes, he said, head buried under the dashboard. "We don't have 2 minutes, Tom said, looking back toward the river. "It's moving." Sarah looked. The Thunderbird had risen to its feet, shaking water from its feathers. The lightning around it was strengthening, the air beginning to crackle with renewed energy. In another few minutes it would be airborne again, and their chance would be lost. "Gus, hurry." "Almost got it." The engine turned over, coughed, died. The floodwaters had reached the engine block, shorting something critical. "Next one," Sarah ordered. "Try the SUV. Higher ground clearance, maybe the engine stayed dry." They ran to the next vehicle, a massive Chevrolet Tahoe that sat on 30-inch tires. Gus attacked it with the same method, stripping wires and sparking connections, while the others stood guard. The Thunderbird screamed. It was a challenge, a declaration of renewed strength. Sarah looked back and saw it spreading its wings, lightning dancing along the pinions. It was preparing to take flight. "Gus." "Got it." The engine roared to life, rough and uneven but functional. Sarah didn't hesitate. She threw open the driver's door and slid behind the wheel. Everyone in. They piled into the Tahoe's spacious interior, Marcus beside her, the others in the back, filling every seat. Sarah jammed the accelerator and the truck surged forward, plowing through the flooded street toward the river. The Thunderbird saw them coming. It turned to face them, wings spread wide, and opened its beak. Lightning gathered, white-hot and terrible, and Sarah knew she had seconds to live. She swerved, not away from the creature but toward it, angling the truck to intercept the downed power lines that dangled from a shattered utility pole. The lines hung low, sparking in the water, and she aimed for the point where they met the surface. "Hold on." The Tahoe struck the water at 40 miles per hour, hydroplaning, sliding, then catching traction on the submerged pavement. The undercarriage scraped against something. The curb, a body, she didn't know and didn't care. The important thing was the power lines, and she was close, so close. The Thunderbird released its lightning. It struck the Tahoe's roof, and for an instant the world went white. Sarah felt her body convulse, every muscle contracting at once, her teeth slamming together with enough force to crack a molar. The steering wheel burned her hands, but she held on, held the course. The power lines. She had to reach the power lines. She floored the accelerator. The Tahoe leaped forward, surging through the water, and struck the utility pole dead center. The impact was bone-jarring, whiplash-inducing, and Sarah's head snapped back against the seat hard enough to see stars. But the pole fell. It toppled slowly, gracefully, the multiple high-voltage lines trailing behind it like ribbons. They hit the water around the Thunderbird in a web of electricity, and the effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The Thunderbird's own lightning met the city's power grid, and the feedback loop was more than even the storm creature could handle. It screamed, a sound like 1,000 transformers exploding, and its body convulsed, wings beating erratically, feathers smoldering. "Back up," Marcus shouted. "Get clear." Sarah threw the Tahoe into reverse and floored it again. The truck lurched backward, away from the deadly electrical field, just as the Thunderbird's convulsions reached their peak. It exploded. Not literally, not with fire and debris, but with light. Pure, blinding light that radiated outward in a sphere, passing through the Tahoe, through the buildings, through everything. Sarah felt it pass through her body, felt her cells vibrate with its energy, and then it was gone. The Thunderbird lay on the riverbank, smoking, its eyes dark, its body still. "Is it dead?" Linda whispered. "It better be," Sarah said, her voice raw, "because I don't think I can do that again." They climbed out of the Tahoe, moving cautiously toward the fallen creature. It didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't spark. The storm had passed, the thunder silent. They had won. Against all odds, against every expectation, they had killed the Thunderbird. But even as relief flooded through her, Sarah felt something else. A presence, old and patient and hungry, watching from the darkness. She turned toward the bluffs and saw the older Piasa there, silhouetted against the sky, its wounded wing healed, its eyes glowing with malevolent intelligence. It had let them fight. It had watched its rival weaken itself against the humans, and now it was ready to claim the victory for itself. The true battle was just beginning. Chapter 8. The Mississippi Runs Red. The older Piasa descended from the bluffs with the inevitability of a landslide, massive and unstoppable. Its wings, wounded no longer, spread to their full span, blocking the stars and the sliver of moon that had emerged from the clouds. It moved slowly, deliberately, giving them time to appreciate their doom. "Run," Sarah said, but her voice lacked conviction. Where could they run? The Thunderbird had at least been vulnerable on the ground, weakened by water. The elder Piasa was fresh, whole, and it had the river at its back. "The church," Father O'Malley said. "We can hold there like before." "It'll just bring the whole building down on us," Marcus argued. "We need to fight, not hide." With what? We used everything we had on the Thunderbird. Then we improvise. The Piasa landed in the street 200 yards away, its weight crushing the pavement, its tail sweeping parked cars aside like toys. It lowered its head and roared, and the sound was like grinding stones, like the earth itself screaming. It wants us to run, Sarah realized. It wants the chase. Then we don't give it the satisfaction, Marcus said. Everyone, spread out, make it choose. If it's going to eat someone, make it work for its meal. They scattered, each survivor running in a different direction, trying to reach cover, trying to survive just a few minutes longer. The Piasa watched them go, its head tracking each movement with reptilian patience. Then it chose. It went for Gus. The old fisherman had run toward the marina, thinking the docks would offer some protection, but he was the farthest from the group, the most isolated. The Piasa moved with terrifying speed, covering the distance in seconds, its claws extended. Gus saw it coming and did the only thing he could think of. He dove into the water. It was a desperate gambit, the river offering concealment if not safety. He swam hard, underwater, trying to reach the far bank. The Piasa didn't follow. It stood at the water's edge, watching, waiting. And then it struck, not with its body but with its tail. The muscular appendage lashed out, catching Gus in mid-stroke, and lifted him from the water like a frog on a spear. Gus screamed, a high thin sound that cut off abruptly as the Piasa's jaws closed around his torso. It didn't swallow him whole as it might have with smaller prey. Instead, it bit down, and the sound of bones snapping was audible even from a distance. The creature chewed, blood spraying from its muzzle, and then swallowed, a lump passing visibly down its throat. "No," Tom shouted, turning back despite the danger. "You son of a bitch." "Tom, don't," Sarah screamed. But the boy was past listening. He charged at the Piasa with his makeshift spear, a sharpened length of rebar, held high above his head. He was fast, fueled by rage and grief, and he almost reached the creature before it noticed him. Almost. The Piasa's head whipped around and it exhaled. Not fire, Sarah would have expected fire from something so dragon-like, but something worse. A cloud of vapor, green-tinged and shimmering, that enveloped Tom before he could react. He stopped running. His skin began to blister, then to peel, sloughing off in sheets as if he'd been dipped in acid. He screamed, dropped the rebar, clawed at his own face, and then fell, writhing, dissolving into something unrecognizable. The Piasa waited until he stopped moving, then bent down and delicately picked up the remains, popping them into its mouth like a delicacy. "Acid," Marcus whispered. "It can spit acid, Jesus Christ." "We need cover," Sarah said. "Real cover, not just debris, something that can withstand that." "The bank vault," Ray said suddenly. "First National Bank. The vault survived the collapse. I saw it when we were scouting earlier. Solid steel, 3 feet thick, if we can get inside." "We can hold out," Sarah finished, "or at least die slower." It wasn't much of a plan, but it was better than standing in the open waiting to be dissolved. They regrouped, those who remained, Sarah, Marcus, Father O'Malley, Ray, Linda, Dave, and Mrs. Patterson. 7 out of the 12 who had set out. The others were dead or scattered, their fates unknown. They ran for the bank, staying together this time, presenting less tempting targets. The Piasa watched them go, seemingly content with its kills for the moment, or perhaps savoring the anticipation of the chase. The bank was as described, a pile of rubble surrounding a square steel protrusion that was the vault door. The building had collapsed around it, but the vault itself had held, its walls and ceiling intact. "The door," Dave gasped, his leg stump throbbing despite the tourniquet. "It's locked, electronic, no power means no opening." "Can we force it?" Marcus asked. "Not a chance, that door weighs 3 tons. "Then we find another way." They circled the vault, looking for weak points, and found one, a ventilation shaft, narrow but possibly large enough for a person to squeeze through. It led down into the vault's interior, designed to prevent suffocation in case of entrapment. "Who's smallest?" Sarah asked. Linda raised her hand. "I am, but I'm claustrophobic." "You want to be out here with that thing, or in there with a door between you." Linda didn't need further encouragement. She approached the vent, pulled off the grate, and squirmed into the opening. For a moment she was stuck, panic evident in her wide eyes, and then she twisted her shoulders and slid downward, disappearing into darkness. They heard her hit bottom, heard her fumbling with the interior mechanisms, and then a grinding sound as the vault's emergency manual release engaged. The door cracked open, a gap of inches. "Help me," Dave said, wedging his body against the door. The others joined him, straining against the massive weight, and slowly, inch by inch, it opened wide enough to admit them. They were inside, door closed and sealed when the Piasa arrived. It had grown tired of waiting, or perhaps it had simply finished digesting its previous victims and wanted dessert. Whatever the reason, it descended on the bank's remains with terrible purpose, tearing through the rubble with claws and teeth, searching for the prey it knew was hiding. "It knows we're here," Mrs. Patterson whimpered, huddled in a corner of the vault. "It can't get in," Ray said. "Right, it can't get through 3 feet of solid steel." "Maybe not," Father O'Malley said, "but it can wait, and it doesn't need to eat, we do." He was right. They were trapped, safe for the moment, but trapped. The vault had no food, no water, and eventually they would have to emerge. The Piasa knew this too. It settled outside the vault with the patience of something that had measured time in centuries and began to sing. It was the most horrible sound Sarah had ever heard. Not a roar or a scream, but a song, a melody that seemed to bypass the ears and speak directly to the brain. It promised things: safety, comfort, an end to fear. It promised that if they would just open the door, just step outside, everything would be fine. "Don't listen," Sarah said, pressing her hands over her ears. "It's trying to hypnotize us." "I know," Marcus said, his face pale, "but it's so beautiful." "Marcus." "I'm not going to open the door, Sarah, but I understand why someone would." The song continued, weaving through their defenses, finding the cracks in their resolve. Mrs. Patterson was weeping openly, murmuring about her grandchildren, about wanting to see them one last time. Dave had passed out from blood loss and shock, mercifully unconscious of the temptation. Hours passed. The Piasa never stopped singing, never stopped waiting, and outside, through the vault's tiny observation window, they could see the sky beginning to lighten. Dawn was coming, and with it, perhaps, new dangers. Sarah slumped against the vault wall, exhausted beyond measure. They had killed the Thunderbird, yes, but the Piasa remained, stronger and more terrible than its rival had ever been. The town was destroyed, the military defeated, and they were 7 people in a metal box, slowly starving while a monster sang them lullabies of death. "There has to be a way," she muttered. "There has to be something we can do." "The poison," Father O'Malley said suddenly. "Chief Watogo defeated the Piasa with poisoned arrows. Perhaps we can find some, make some." "Find it where? Everything's destroyed." "The pharmacy, or the hospital. There must be something toxic, something that can harm that creature." "And how do we administer it? We can't exactly ask it to take its medicine." "We use bait," Marcus said slowly. "Like before, but this time the bait is poisoned." "You want to poison ourselves?" "No, we find something the Piasa wants more than us, something we can contaminate." Sarah thought, what would the Piasa want? It was a creature of the river, of the deep places. It hoarded things, according to some legends. Jewels, gold, precious objects that it took from its victims. "The diamond," she said, "the one from the museum." "What diamond?" "River Bluff has a small historical museum. They had a diamond on display, found in the riverbed decades ago. The Piasa legend says the creature hoards gems, treasures. If we could get to that diamond, coat it with poison. The museum is on the other side of town, Ray said, miles from here. And we're trapped in a vault, Linda added. But we're alive, Sarah said. And as long as we're alive, we have a chance. We wait for the Piasa to leave or get distracted, and then we make our move. And if it never leaves? Sarah looked at the vault door, at the 3 feet of steel between them and death. Then we die in here instead of out there. Either way, we don't give it the satisfaction of the kill. They settled in to wait, conserving their strength, taking turns watching through the observation window while the others tried to rest. The Piasa's song never stopped, but they learned to ignore it, to filter it out like white noise. Outside, the sun rose on a town that had become a charnel house, and the last battle of River Bluff was about to begin. Chapter 9: Desperate Measures. Morning brought no relief, only a clearer view of the devastation. Through the vault's observation window, Sarah could see the full extent of the destruction. Buildings flattened, streets flooded, the river itself choked with debris. And everywhere bodies. The dead lay where they had fallen, torn apart, burned, dissolved. The Piasa had been thorough in its feeding. The creature itself was visible, coiled atop the rubble like a snake on a rock, basking in the morning sun. Its eyes were closed, but Sarah knew it wasn't sleeping. It was waiting, patient, secure in the knowledge that its prey would eventually emerge. It looked smaller, Marcus observed, joining her at the window. In the daylight, less supernatural. It's still supernatural enough to destroy a town, Sarah said. Don't underestimate it. I was just thinking. If it looks like an animal, maybe it can be killed like one. How we've tried everything. Electricity, physical trauma, drowning. It heals faster than we can hurt it. Everything we've tried has been external. What if we get inside? Sarah looked at him. Inside. Its mouth is big enough to swallow a person whole. Chief Watogo offered himself as bait. What if we do the same but with explosives? Or acid? Something that destroys it from within. That's suicide, Marcus. Everything is suicide at this point. At least this way we take it with us. Sarah considered. It was insane, the kind of plan that only made sense in the darkest hours of desperation. But Marcus was right. They were going to die anyway. The question was whether their deaths would have purpose. The museum first, she said. If we can find the poison, the diamond, we try that. If it fails, then we consider your plan. Agreed. They turned to the others, explaining the situation, gauging willingness. Dave was too weak to travel, his stump infected, fever burning through him. Mrs. Patterson volunteered to stay with him, to tend him as best she could. The rest, Sarah, Marcus, Father O'Malley, Ray, and Linda, would make the attempt. The Piasa will see us leave, Linda pointed out. It won't let us just walk away. We'll create a diversion, Sarah said. Something to draw its attention elsewhere. Like what? Sarah looked at Dave, unconscious and dying. Like the truth. They waited until midday, when the sun was highest and the Piasa seemed most lethargic. Then they enacted their plan. The vault door opened with a grinding protest, and Father O'Malley stepped out alone, holding his rosary, his Bible, and a white flag improvised from Mrs. Patterson's blouse. Creature of the river, he shouted, his voice carrying across the ruined town. I would parley. The Piasa's head lifted, eyes opening, regarding the priest with ancient intelligence. It didn't attack immediately, which Sarah took as a good sign. It was curious, or perhaps amused. I am a servant of God, Father O'Malley continued, walking slowly toward the creature. I know you're kind, river spirit. I know that you can understand me, that you have wisdom beyond the beasts of the field. I ask you, spare these people. Take me instead. An old man, a life already lived, in exchange for the young. The Piasa uncoiled, rising to its full height, and Father O'Malley stopped, trembling but standing his ground. The creature approached him, head lowering until it was inches from the priest's face. It sniffed, tongue flicking, tasting the air. "Take me," Father O'Malley whispered. "Let the others go." The Piasa opened its mouth, and for a moment Sarah thought it would accept the offer, swallow the priest whole. But instead it exhaled, not the acid cloud this time, but something else, something that made Father O'Malley stagger, his eyes rolling back. When he recovered, his face had changed. The fear was gone, replaced by a strange serenity, a glassy peace. "The master accepts," he said, but his voice was wrong, layered as if something else spoke through him. "The master will feed, but not on you, old man. You will serve. You will bring the others." "Father," Sarah shouted, emerging from the vault. "Father O'Malley, fight it." But the priest didn't even turn. He walked toward the Piasa, placed his hand on its scaled flank, and stood there like a man with his dog. "Possession," Marcus breathed. "The legends were true, it can control people." "Then we have a bigger problem," Sarah said. "We can't just kill it, we have to save him too." "Or kill them both," Ray said grimly, "if he's compromised." "He's not dead, there's still a chance." "Sarah, look at him." She looked. Father O'Malley was smiling, a beatific expression that belonged on a saint, not a man standing next to a monster. But his eyes were empty, void of everything that had made him human. "The diamond," she said, her voice hardening. "We get the diamond, that's our priority." They moved, using the distraction of Father O'Malley's negotiation to slip away. The Piasa was focused on its new servant and didn't notice as the four of them crept through the ruins, heading toward the museum district. It took an hour of careful movement, avoiding the creature's line of sight, staying low and silent. They passed scenes of horror that Sarah knew would haunt her forever if she survived. A child's doll floating in bloody water, a wedding ring on a severed finger, a family photo in a frame that was now half melted from acid. The museum was still standing, surprisingly intact. The Piasa had focused on populated areas, and the small historical society building had been spared the worst of the destruction. Its doors were locked, but a broken window provided entry. Inside they found chaos. Display cases shattered, artifacts scattered, the curator's body crushed beneath a toppled dinosaur skeleton replica. But the vault, the museum's small safe, was still closed, still secure. "Ray, can you open it?" Sarah asked. "I can try." He worked on the lock while the others stood guard. Linda found a display of Native American artifacts and grabbed a flint knife, a tomahawk, anything that might serve as a weapon. Marcus discovered the curator's office and emerged with a bottle of formaldehyde and a jar of arsenic-based rat poison. "These might work," he said. "The formaldehyde could damage tissue, the arsenic. Slow poison, we need something fast." "It's what we have." The safe clicked open and Ray pulled out the contents, a velvet bag containing the diamond. It was large, 2 carats at least, flawed but beautiful in its own way. The museum card said it had been found by a fisherman in 1923, deposited in the river by ancient floods. "Perfect," Sarah said, taking the gem. "Now we poison it." They coated the diamond with a paste made from the rat poison and formaldehyde, creating a toxic bait that would sicken anything that swallowed it. Then they added Linda's suggestion, ground glass from a broken display case, tiny shards that would tear the creature's insides. "It's ready," Sarah said, holding the contaminated gem. "Now we just need to deliver it." "And Father O'Malley?" Linda asked. "We save him if we can, but the priority is killing the Piasa." They made their way back toward the bank vault, toward the creature that waited with its new servant. The sun was beginning to set, painting the destruction in shades of blood and gold, and Sarah knew that whatever happened next would determine the fate of River Bluff. And perhaps the fate of the world, if the Piasa decided to move on once it had finished here. The creature was waiting where they had left it, Father O'Malley still standing by its side like a faithful hound. It saw them coming and made a sound, not a roar, but something almost like laughter. "You return," the priest said, but it was the Piasa speaking through him. "Good. The master is hungry and you are small but numerous." "We bring an offering," Sarah said, holding up the diamond. "A treasure from the river, a tribute." The Piasa's eyes fixed on the gem, and Sarah saw desire there, ancient greed. It remembered this diamond, she realized. It had lost it or had it stolen centuries ago. It wanted it back. "Give," the creature commanded. "Release the priest first," Sarah countered. "Let him go and the diamond is yours." "You bargain," the laughter again, horrible and wet. "You have nothing, you are meat, but the stone has value. Very well, the servant is released." Father O'Malley collapsed, gasping, his eyes clearing of the possession. He looked around, confused, terrified, saw the Piasa beside him and scrambled backward. "Run," Sarah shouted. "Father, run." He ran, stumbling toward the church, toward safety. The Piasa let him go, its attention fixed on the diamond. "Give," it commanded again. Sarah threw the gem. It sailed through the air, a glittering arc in the sunset, and the Piasa snapped it from the air with unerring accuracy. It swallowed, the lump passing down its throat, and then it waited, tasting, testing. "What now?" Marcus whispered. "Now we hope," Sarah said. For a moment nothing happened. The Piasa regarded them with amusement, thinking itself clever for having gained a treasure and a meal in one transaction. Then its expression changed. Confusion. Pain. It roared, the sound different now, laced with agony. Its body convulsed, scales rippling as the poison took hold. It thrashed, tail sweeping through the ruins, crushing what little remained standing. "It's working," Linda cried. "Stay back," Sarah warned. "It's not dead yet." The Piasa's thrashing intensified. It rolled, crushing itself against the ground, trying to dislodge whatever was burning inside it. Blood, green, foul-smelling, erupted from its mouth, its nostrils, its eyes. The poison was tearing it apart from within. But it wasn't dying fast enough. Sarah could see that. The creature was wounded, yes, in agony, but it was healing even as it suffered, its ancient constitution fighting the toxins. "It needs more," she said. "It needs something else." "I have an idea," Marcus said, "but I need to get close." "Marcus, no. Cover me." He ran, not away from the creature but toward it, carrying the bottle of formaldehyde and a lighter he had found in the museum. The Piasa was too consumed by its own pain to notice him. Its attention turned inward, fighting the battle for its own survival. Marcus reached the creature's head and did something insane. He climbed onto its snout, wedging his feet against its teeth, and pried open its lower jaw. The Piasa's mouth gaped, and Marcus poured the formaldehyde down its throat, directly into the open wound the poison had created. Then he jumped, hitting the ground and rolling as the Piasa snapped its jaws shut. "Now," he screamed, "hit it now." Sarah understood. She grabbed the flint knife from Linda and struck it against the stone, creating a shower of sparks. The formaldehyde ignited. The Piasa's head disappeared in a fireball, flames erupting from its mouth, its nostrils, even its eyes. It screamed, a sound of pure agony that shattered windows for miles around and thrashed with renewed violence. Fire consumed it, burning from within, the perfect combination of poison and flame. It thrashed for 5 minutes, 10, long enough that Sarah was sure it would never die, that it would heal from even this. But gradually the movement slowed. The flames died down, leaving charred flesh and exposed bone. The creature's eyes, those terrible intelligent eyes, went dark. And finally, the Piasa bird was still. "Is it?" Linda started. "It's dead," Sarah confirmed, approaching cautiously. "It's actually dead." They gathered around the fallen Titan, 7 survivors of a town that had housed 12,000. They were battered, broken, burned, but alive. And they had won. But even as they celebrated, even as they wept with relief and grief, Sarah felt the weight of what they had done. They had killed gods, ancient spirits that had existed since before human memory. They had changed the world, ended legends, proven that even the divine could die. And she wondered, with a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air, what other things might be waking now, stirred from their slumber by the death screams of their kin. The War of the Titans was over. But the Age of Monsters was just beginning. Chapter 10, Cathedral of Bones. The aftermath of the battle was worse than the fighting itself. Sarah had prepared herself for death, for the quick oblivion of a monster's maw or the sharp finality of lightning. What she hadn't prepared for was the silence that followed victory, the empty ringing in her ears where screams and thunder had been, and the sight of what remained of River Bluff. They made their way back to St. Mary's Church in the gathering dark, carrying Dave and Mrs. Patterson between them. The wounded man had developed a fever, his stump infected, and he drifted in and out of consciousness as they walked. Mrs. Patterson was unharmed physically, but her eyes were vacant, her mind seemingly broken by the horrors she had witnessed. The church still stood, remarkably intact despite everything. The stone walls had withstood the battle, though the roof had partially collapsed and rain dripped through in a dozen places. Father O'Malley was waiting for them, having made his way back through the ruins. He was changed, Sarah saw. The possession had left its mark, a white streak in his hair where none had been before, a tremor in his hands that hadn't been there yesterday. "You killed it," he said, not quite a question. "The Piasa, you actually killed it." "We killed them both," Marcus confirmed, setting Dave down on a pew. "The Thunderbird and the Piasa, they're dead." "Then it's over." Sarah exchanged a glance with Marcus. "It should be, but—" "But what?" "The younger Piasa. We only saw one body in the river. There might be others, and the eggs." "Eggs?" Linda's voice rose in panic. "What eggs?" "The Piasa was a dragon or dragon-like. Dragons lay eggs. If there are nests, if there are young." "We have to find them," Father O'Malley said. "Destroy them before they hatch." "In the morning," Sarah said firmly. "Tonight we rest, we tend the wounded, we gather our strength." "What if they hatch tonight?" "Then we deal with it. But we're no good to anyone if we collapse from exhaustion." Reluctantly, they agreed. The church was the safest place in town, or what passed for safety now. They posted watches at the doors and the bell tower, 2-hour shifts, keeping vigil against whatever might come in the night. Sarah took first watch, climbing the tower stairs despite her aching muscles. The view from above was haunting. Fires still burned in the distance, the river still choked with debris and the bodies. So many bodies, scattered like dolls discarded by a careless child. But there was something else. Movement in the shadows near the riverbank. Sarah squinted, trying to make out details in the moonlight, and saw them. Figures, human-shaped but moving wrong, too fluid, too jointless. They crept toward the Piasa's corpse, gathering around it, touching it, crooning in voices that carried even to her height. The worshippers, the ones who had marched to sacrifice themselves. Not all had been eaten, apparently. Some had survived, and now they mourned their god. Or worse. Sarah watched as they produced tools from the ruins, knives, axes, crude instruments, and began to butcher the Piasa's body. They weren't mourning. They were harvesting. "Marcus," she called down the stairs, "get up here now." He came, still weary but alert, and she pointed out what she had seen. "They're taking pieces of it," he breathed. "Scales, claws, organs." "For what?" "I don't know, but it can't be good." They watched until the cultists finished their work, loading their grisly cargo into wheelbarrows and carts, disappearing into the darkness toward the bluffs. The Piasa's corpse was diminished, carved up, but the cultists had been careful, systematic. They knew what they were doing. "In the morning," Sarah repeated, but with less conviction. "We stopped them in the morning." But morning brought worse news. Dave was dead. The infection had spread despite their best efforts, reaching his heart in the night. He had passed quietly, feverishly, slipping away while the others slept. Mrs. Patterson was gone too, not dead but vanished, her mind finally snapping. She had wandered out in the night, seeking her grandchildren who had died years before, and no one had noticed until dawn. They were down to 6 now. Sarah, Marcus, Father O'Malley, Ray, Linda, and Tom's memory haunting them all. "We need to move," Sarah said, after they had buried Dave in the church's small cemetery. "The cultists are active and there might be more creatures. We need to find the nest before they do." "How?" Ray asked. "The bluffs are miles long, honeycombed with caves. It could take weeks to search them all." "The original painting," Marcus said suddenly. "The pictographs. They weren't just decorations. They were markers. The Piasa painted its territory, marked its hunting grounds. The nest would be near the original site." "Which is where?" "The museum had maps, historical surveys from the 1800s, if we can find them." They returned to the museum, now doubly cautious, expecting ambush at every turn. But the town was eerily silent, the cultists having retreated to wherever their base was. They found the maps in the curator's office, yellow documents that showed the original location of the Piasa painting. "There," Sarah said, pointing. "A cave system 3 miles north of town. The surveyors noted unusual geothermal activity and strange carvings." "That's it," Marcus agreed, "the nest." They armed themselves as best they could: tomahawks, knives, a shotgun Ray found in a ruined police car with 3 shells remaining. It wasn't much against what they might face, but it was all they had. The walk to the bluffs took 3 hours, through territory that had become alien. The flood had reshaped the landscape, creating new channels, depositing debris in unexpected places. They navigated by the sun and the maps, moving carefully, always alert. The cave entrance was exactly where the maps indicated, hidden behind a screen of vegetation that had survived the flooding. But someone had been there recently. The vegetation was trampled, and fresh tracks led inside. "The cultists," Linda whispered. "They're already here." "Then we're too late," Ray said. "Not necessarily," Sarah said. "If they're here, they might be distracted. We can use that." They crept into the cave, following the sound of chanting. The passage was narrow at first, then widened into a natural cathedral of limestone, stalactites hanging like teeth from the ceiling. And in the center of the chamber, illuminated by torchlight, was the nest. It wasn't what Sarah had expected. No eggs, no soft bed of vegetation. Instead, a pool of water, fed by an underground spring, and floating in that water were 3 shapes. Not eggs, but cocoons, translucent membranes containing something that twitched and stirred. "They're not eggs," Marcus breathed. "They're transforming." The cultists were gathered around the pool, a dozen of them, naked except for paint made from the Piasa's blood. They were chanting in a language Sarah didn't recognize, old and guttural, the words twisting in her ears like things alive. "What are they doing?" Linda asked. "Finishing what the Piasa started," Father O'Malley said, his voice hollow. "Creating more of their kind, the cocoons. Those are people. The ones who disappeared, they're being changed." "We have to stop them," Sarah said. "Destroy the cocoons, kill the cultists if we have to." "There are 12 of them and 6 of us," Ray pointed out, "and we have 3 shotgun shells." "Then we improvise." They split up, circling the chamber, taking positions behind stalagmites and rock formations. Sarah raised her hand, counted down from 3, and they attacked. The battle was chaos. The cultists were unarmed but fanatical, throwing themselves at the intruders with bare hands and teeth. Sarah swung her tomahawk, felt it bite into flesh, heard screams. Marcus used the shotgun, the boom deafening in the enclosed space, dropping 2 cultists with 1 shot. But there were too many. They were overwhelmed, dragged down, their weapons torn from their hands. Sarah found herself pinned beneath a woman who had been a librarian, a sweet middle-aged woman who was now snarling like an animal, trying to tear out Sarah's throat with her fingers. "The cocoons," Father O'Malley shouted. "Destroy the cocoons." He had broken free somehow and was running toward the pool. A cultist tackled him, but he was already in motion, already falling. He hit the water with a splash, and his hand closed on the nearest cocoon. He tore it open. What emerged was no longer human, but not yet Piasa either. A thing of scales and feathers, of limbs too numerous and joints that bent wrong. It screamed, high and piercing, and died as its incomplete form collapsed. "No," the cultists froze, their attention drawn to the dying hybrid. "The children, he kills the children." Sarah used the distraction. She kneed the librarian in the stomach, threw her off, and grabbed her tomahawk. She hacked at the next cultist, opening his throat, then the next. Marcus had recovered the shotgun, fired again, the last 2 shells dropping 3 more of the fanatics. Ray and Linda were fighting together, back to back, holding off a wave of attackers. But they were tiring, bleeding, and the cultists kept coming. "The cocoons," Father O'Malley shouted again, still in the water. "I need help." Sarah fought her way to him, Marcus covering her, and together they tore at the remaining cocoons. Each one contained a horror, a transformation in progress, and each one died as air touched its unfinished form. "No," the cultists screamed, the chant becoming a wail of despair. The master's children." "Your master is dead," Sarah shouted. "We killed it, we killed your god." "Liar, heretic, the master never dies, the master only sleeps." They rushed her, a final desperate assault, and Sarah met them with steel and fury. She killed 3, 4, lost count in the red haze of combat. Marcus fought beside her and Father O'Malley, and somehow they held. When it was over, 12 cultists lay dead in the chamber, and the survivors stood panting, bleeding, victorious but hollow. "Is that all of them?" Linda asked, leaning on Ray for support. "All that were here," Father O'Malley said, "but there may be others, there may be other nests." "Then we hunt them," Sarah said. "One by one, nest by nest, cult by cult, we hunt them until they're all gone." "And then what?" Marcus asked quietly. "We can't stay here. The town is destroyed. The government will come eventually, quarantine the area, study what's left. They'll want to know what happened. We'll tell them. Will they believe us?" Sarah looked at the dead cultists, at the destroyed cocoons, at the nightmare they had survived. "They'll have to. The evidence is everywhere." But even as she spoke, she felt the weight of what they had done. They had ended legends, killed gods, destroyed something that had existed for millennia. And in doing so, they had changed the world in ways they couldn't yet understand. The age of monsters was ending. But what came after might be worse. Chapter 11, Last Stand. They emerged from the cave into afternoon light, blinking, disoriented. 3 hours underground had felt like days, time stretching in the darkness. The world outside had changed, or perhaps they had simply noticed what they had missed before. Military aircraft circled overhead, helicopters, jets, drones. The cavalry had arrived, too late to save River Bluff but in time to contain the aftermath. Soldiers in hazmat suits were moving through the ruins, collecting samples, photographing bodies, establishing a perimeter. "They're quarantining the area," Marcus observed. "Standard protocol for biological or anomalous incidents." "Will they help us?" Linda asked. "They'll contain us first, decide if we're threats, then maybe help." They approached the nearest soldiers with hands raised, weapons discarded. The response was immediate and aggressive, weapons trained on them, orders shouted through megaphones to lie down, to surrender, to comply. They complied. They were too tired, too wounded to resist. They lay on the wet ground, hands behind their heads, while soldiers approached cautiously, checking them for infection, for weapons, for anything that might explain how they had survived when thousands had died. "You're Dr. Sarah Chen," A woman in a colonel's uniform approached, reading from a tablet. Folklore professor. Yes. And you claim responsibility for neutralizing the threats. Threats? You mean the giant monsters that destroyed your town? Yes, we killed them. Is that a problem? The colonel's expression didn't change. Dr. Chen, you're being detained under the National Security Act. You'll be transported to a secure facility for debriefing. Your companions as well. We need medical attention, hospitalization. You'll receive appropriate care. When? After debriefing. They were loaded into armored vehicles, separated, their wounds given only cursory attention. Sarah protested, demanded, threatened, and was ignored. The military machine had arrived and individual concerns were irrelevant. The facility was underground, she realized when they finally let her out of the vehicle. A concrete bunker or series of bunkers deep beneath the earth. The walls were thick, the doors heavy, and the guards were armed with weapons she didn't recognize. Welcome to Site 17, the colonel said, leading her down a corridor. This is where we study anomalies, like the ones you encountered. You've seen them before. We've seen many things, Dr. Chen. The Thunderbird and Piasa were new to us, but not unprecedented. There have been other incidents, other awakenings. Awakenings. That's what we call them. When something old and powerful remembers that it exists. The world is full of sleeping giants, Dr. Chen, and lately they've been waking up. They reached an interrogation room, bare except for a table and 2 chairs. The colonel gestured for Sarah to sit, then took the opposite chair. Tell me everything, she said, from the beginning. Sarah told her. The research, the discovery, the battle, the aftermath. She left nothing out, even the parts that made her sound crazy or criminal. The colonel listened without interruption, taking notes, occasionally consulting her tablet. And the cultists, she asked when Sarah finished. The nest. Destroyed all of them, the cocoons too. You're certain? I saw them die. Good, that's one less problem. One less, how many are there? The colonel was silent for a moment, then slid her tablet across the table. On the screen, a map of the world dotted with red markers, hundreds of them. These are active or potential awakening sites. The Thunderbird and Piasa were just the beginning. Something is stirring them, calling them back. We don't know what yet, but we know it's accelerating. Sarah stared at the map, at the red dots spreading like a plague across the continents. What are you going to do? Fight, contain, survive. The same thing you did in River Bluff, but on a larger scale. And we need people like you. People who understand these things, who can think like they do, anticipate their movements. You want to recruit me? We want to save the world, Dr. Chen, and we need all the help we can get. Sarah thought of the survivors, Marcus, Father O'Malley, Ray, and Linda. She thought of the dead, Tom, Dave, Gus, the thousands of nameless others. She thought of the Piasa's eyes, ancient and hungry, and the Thunderbird's lightning, beautiful and deadly. I'll help, she said, but on my terms. I want access to my team. I want resources. I want the truth about what we're facing. Granted, within reason. And I want one more thing. Name it. When we find whatever's waking these things, I want to be there when it dies. The colonel smiled for the first time. That can be arranged. Chapter 12, Survivors. The weeks that followed were a blur of debriefings, medical treatments, and classified briefings. Sarah learned more than she had ever wanted to know about the world beneath the world, the secret history of monsters and magic, the ancient civilizations that had risen and fallen while humanity crawled in the shadows, the true nature of gods and spirits. She learned that the Thunderbird was not unique, that there were others of its kind scattered across the Americas, sleeping in mountains and storms. She learned that the Piasa was part of a larger family of river dragons, that its kind had once ruled the Mississippi from source to sea. She learned that humanity had forgotten these things by design, a collective amnesia enforced by ancient powers that wanted humanity ignorant and controllable. But the amnesia was breaking down, the walls were thinning, and something was coming through. Her team was assembled slowly, carefully. Marcus joined first, his knowledge of cryptid lore proving invaluable. Father O'Malley came next, his experience with possession making him an expert on spiritual contamination. Ray and Linda joined as support staff, their survival skills and civilian perspective providing balance. They were given a name, Task Force Cryptid, designation TFC-1. Their mission, to hunt and neutralize awakened entities before they could destroy civilization. Their first assignment came 6 weeks after River Bluff. Scotland, the colonel said, briefing them in a secure room deep beneath Site 17. Loch Ness region, something stirring in the deep water. Local reports of disappearances, strange sounds, bodies washing ashore. Nessie, Marcus asked, the Loch Ness monster is real. Oh yes, very real, and very different from the tourist attraction. The real creature. Well, you'll see when you get there. What kind of different? Sarah asked. The Piasa was a dragon. The Thunderbird was a storm spirit. The thing in Loch Ness is something else entirely, something older, something hungry. Aren't they all? This one's worse. They flew to Scotland on a military transport, 6 survivors of one nightmare heading into another. Sarah sat by the window, watching the clouds, and thought about the Piasa's final scream, the way the fire had consumed it, the silence that followed. We did good, Marcus said, sitting beside her. Back in River Bluff, we saved lives. We killed gods, Sarah replied. That's not something you come back from. Maybe the world is better off without them. Maybe, or maybe we just made room for something worse. The transport banked, descending toward a private airfield in the Scottish Highlands. Below, Sarah could see the dark waters of Loch Ness, miles of deep, cold mystery. Whatever's down there, she said, we'll stop it, just like we stopped the others. And if we can't, then we die trying. That's the job now. That's who we are. The landing gear touched down, and Task Force Cryptid emerged into a new world of fog and rain and ancient legends. The age of monsters had begun in earnest, and they were on the front lines. But Sarah carried something with her from River Bluff, something the colonel hadn't noticed, something she hadn't reported. A scale from the Piasa's body, tucked in her pocket, warm against her skin. It was changing her. She could feel it slowly, subtly. Her senses were sharper, her reflexes faster, her dreams filled with rivers and darkness and the sweet taste of blood. The Piasa had marked her, or she had marked herself by killing it. She didn't know what she was becoming, but she knew that the war was far from over and that the final battle had only just begun. In the depths of Loch Ness, something stirred. And Sarah Chin, survivor of River Bluff, killer of gods, smiled. The hunt continued. Chapter 13. The Scars Remain. 6 months had passed since River Bluff, and the world had changed in ways that most people would never understand. The official story was that a Category 5 tornado had struck the Mississippi River Valley, causing catastrophic flooding and structural damage. 12,000 people had died. The town had been declared uninhabitable, and the area was now a restricted zone due to environmental contamination. The truth was buried under layers of classification, known only to a select few who had clearance and need to know. Task Force Cryptid was one of those few, and Sarah Chen had become something she had never expected, a monster hunter. She stood now on the shores of Loch Ness, the Scottish mist clinging to her skin like a second layer of damp. The loch stretched before her, dark and still, 24 miles of water that hid depths no human had ever measured. Somewhere in those depths, something ancient waited, something that had survived the extinction of the dinosaurs, something that had learned patience in a way that made the Piasa seem like a mayfly. Sonar contact, Marcus called from the boat's cabin. 300 meters depth. Jesus, depth reading is off the scale. Define off the scale, Sarah said, moving to join him. The equipment maxes out at 300 meters. This thing is deeper, much deeper. Then it's not the Loch Ness monster. Nessie is supposed to be a surface dweller, a plesiosaur or something. This is something else. Agreed. They had been hunting it for 3 weeks, tracking disappearances, analyzing sightings, laying traps. 4 people had vanished in the last month, pulled from boats, from the shore, from the very streets of Drumnadrochit in the night. The local constabulary had called it a serial killer, but Sarah knew better. The pattern was wrong for human, too precise, too hungry. We need to go deeper, she said. Deploy the submersible. Sarah, that's insane. We don't know what's down there. That's why we're here, to find out, to stop it. Marcus looked at her, concern in his eyes. He had noticed the changes too, the way she had become harder, colder, more like the things they hunted. The scale in her pocket had done something to her, or she had done something to herself by keeping it. Either way, she was no longer the academic she had been. You used to say we should observe first, he said quietly. Study, understand. And we did. We studied, we understood, and people kept dying. Now we act. But deploy the submersible, Marcus. That's in order. He hesitated, then nodded. Yes, ma'am. The submersible was a prototype military tech reverse-engineered from something that had washed up on a beach in Maine. It was small, 2-person capacity, capable of withstanding pressure that would crush a conventional vessel. Sarah would pilot it herself, alone, while Marcus monitored from the surface. You're sure about this? He asked as she climbed into the hatch. No, but I'm doing it anyway. She sealed the hatch and began her descent. The lock closed around her, green fading to gray, gray fading to black. The submersible's lights cut through the darkness, revealing particles of organic matter drifting like snow, the occasional fish darting past, the walls of the lock that dropped away into nothingness. 100 meters, 200, 300 and still descending. At 400 meters, the pressure gauge redlined, but the hull held. The submersible was rated for 600, maybe more. She continued. 500, 6, 7. The bottom should have been visible, should have been approaching. But the sonar showed only open water below, an abyss that seemed to have no end. 800 meters. And then she saw it. Not at the bottom, because there was no bottom, but floating in the darkness, vast and pale and terrible. A creature that defied classification, part eel, part squid, part something that had never been catalogued by human science. It was massive, easily 100 meters long, with tentacles that trailed behind it like the train of a wedding dress, and eyes, so many eyes that glowed with bioluminescence in the dark. It was looking at her. She knew it was looking at her, even through the metal hull, even through the pressure and the dark. Those eyes saw her, recognized her, judged her. And it spoke. Not in words, not in sound, but directly into her mind. A voice like bubbles rising through deep water, like the groan of shifting tectonic plates. Little sister, it said, you carry the mark, you carry the death. Sarah felt her heart stutter. The scale in her pocket was warm, pulsing, responding to the creature's voice. I killed it, she thought, not knowing if the creature could hear. I killed the river dragon. I know, I felt its ending, a scream in the deep, a silence where there had been song. You are the silence bringer, the death dealer. Are you here to avenge it? Laughter, if such a sound could be called laughter, the creaking of ancient joints, the settling of seabed sediment. Avenge? No, the river dragon was young, foolish, greedy. It consumed without balance, took without giving. Its death was appropriate. But you, little sister, you who carry the mark, you interest me. I'm not your sister, I'm human. Are you? Feel your blood, feel the change. The scale you keep is not merely a trophy, it is a seed, it grows within you. Sarah felt it then, truly felt it. The scale was not in her pocket anymore. It was in her, part of her, cells dividing and transforming, rewriting her DNA one strand at a time. She was becoming something else, something other. "What are you?" she asked. "I am the old one, the deep one, the patient watcher in the dark. I have slept since before your kind learned to walk upright, and I will sleep again when your kind returns to the dust. I am not your enemy, silence bringer. I am your future." "I don't want this." "Want? What is want? The river flows, the sun rises, you change. These are not choices, these are truths." "Then what do you want? Why show yourself to me?" The creature drifted closer, filling her viewport with pale flesh and glowing eyes. It was beautiful, Sarah realized, in a way that had nothing to do with human aesthetics. It was the beauty of a shark, of a tsunami, of a mountain eroding over millennia. "I want," it said, "what all my kind want. I want to survive. And something is coming, little sister. Something that threatens even me. The awakenings you have seen, they are not random. They are preparation. The old powers are stirring, arming themselves because they know what approaches." What's coming?" "The end, the beginning, the cycle completed. I do not have the words in your tongue, but you will learn in time. You will learn or you will die." "Tell me, help me understand." "I have said enough. Go now. Return to your surface, your air, your brief flickering life. But remember what you have seen. Remember that the deep exists, that patience exists, that some things cannot be killed by fire and steel. And the people you've taken, the ones you've killed. Sustenance, necessity. Your kind takes from the world without asking. I take from your kind without apology. Balance. I could kill you." The laughter again. "You could try. And perhaps with the river dragon's power growing in you, you might even succeed. But would you? The submersible carries weapons, yes. I can taste their metal, their chemicals. But can you doom this body when your own body is becoming like mine?" Sarah hesitated. The creature was right. She could fire the torpedoes, release the depth charges, destroy this ancient being. But something held her back. Fear, yes, but also curiosity, also kinship. Also the growing certainty that she would need allies in whatever was coming. "I'll let you live," she said. "This time, but stop taking people. Find another food source." "Lord." "Or I'll come back, and next time I won't hesitate." "Brave words, little sister. We shall see if you can back them with action. Go now, before I decide that you are too dangerous to let live." Sarah didn't wait to be told twice. She fired the ascent jets, the submersible climbing rapidly, leaving the old one behind in the crushing dark. As she rose, she felt its eyes on her, its attention following her, and she knew that she had made a choice that would define her life. She had spared a monster, because she was becoming one. Chapter 14. Legends Never Die. The surface was cold and bright after the depths, and Sarah emerged from the submersible to find Marcus waiting with a blanket and hot coffee. He didn't ask what she had seen. One look at her face told him that she had seen something that had changed her. "There's been a development," he said quietly, "while you were down there, a signal from Site 17. "What kind of signal?" "An awakening, multiple awakenings, all across the world all at once." Sarah took the coffee, sipped it, felt the heat spread through her chest. "How many?" "Hundreds, maybe thousands. Everything is waking up, Sarah, everything." The Colonel's map was just the beginning. This is bigger, this is apocalyptic. They returned to the boat, to the communications equipment, to the encrypted message that had come through while Sarah was in the deep. The Colonel's face appeared on the screen, haggard, afraid. The first time Sarah had ever seen her afraid. "Dr. Chin, I'm glad you're back." "What's happening?" "The end of the world if we're not careful. The things we've been tracking, the potential awakenings. They're not potential anymore. They're active, simultaneous, coordinated." "Coordinated? You mean something is controlling them?" Or summoning them. We don't know, but whatever it is, it's powerful, more powerful than anything we've ever encountered. Where is it, the source? The colonel hesitated. We think it's in River Bluff. Sarah felt ice in her veins. River Bluff, but we destroyed everything there. The Piasa, the Thunderbird, the cultists, the nest. You destroyed the avatars, the vessels, but the power that inhabited them, the consciousness behind them, it wasn't destroyed. It was displaced. And now it's gathering strength, preparing to return in full. Preparing for what? Apotheosis. The creature, the entity, whatever it is, it wants to become something more than a monster. It wants to become a god. And if it succeeds, humanity is finished. Sarah thought of the Old One's words, the warning about something coming, something that even the ancient powers feared. This was it. This was what they had been preparing for. What do you need from me? Everything, your team, your knowledge, your transformation. Sarah froze. What? We've been monitoring you, Dr. Chen. The scale, the changes. We know what you're becoming, and we need that. We need someone who can fight these things on their own terms, who can think like them, move like them, kill like them. You want to use me as a weapon. We want you to be what you were always meant to be, the bridge between worlds, the one who walks in both light and dark. And if I refuse, then you die. The transformation is already too advanced to stop. Without our help, without our resources, you'll complete the change in months, maybe weeks. And when you do, you'll be no different from the things we hunt. Sarah looked at her hands, at the faint scaling that had begun to appear on her wrists, at the claws that were growing where her fingernails had been. She was changing. She couldn't deny it anymore. What do I have to do? Come back to Site 17. We'll prepare you, train you, turn you into what you need to be. And then you go back to River Bluff. You face the thing that started all this, and you finish it once and for all. Sarah looked out at Loch Ness, at the dark water that hid ancient secrets. She thought of the Piasa's eyes, the Thunderbird's lightning, the Old One's patient wisdom. She thought of all the people who had died, all the monsters she had killed, all the nightmares she had survived. I'm coming, she said, but on my terms. I lead the team, I make the decisions, and when this is over, I'm done. I get to walk away. Agreed. And Marcus, he comes with me no matter what. He's already on the manifest. Good. She ended the transmission and turned to Marcus, who had heard everything. You're really going to do this, he said, not a question. I don't have a choice. You always have a choice. Then I choose to fight, to end this before it consumes everything. And after? Sarah smiled, and for the first time Marcus saw something alien in it, something that wasn't quite human anymore. After, we see. Maybe there's a place for monsters in the new world. Maybe we make one. They flew back to the United States that night, crossing the Atlantic in a military transport that carried other teams, other survivors from other incidents. Sarah met them, spoke with them, learned their stories. A woman who had survived a Wendigo attack in Canada, a man who had fought a chupacabra in Puerto Rico, a child who had somehow tamed a Baku and kept it as a pet. They were all marked, all changed, all caught between two worlds. And they were all gathering now, called to River Bluff by forces they didn't understand, to fight a battle that would determine the fate of humanity. Site 17 was buzzing with activity when they arrived, transformed from a quiet research facility into a war room. Maps covered the walls, showing awakening sites that multiplied by the hour. Video feeds showed monsters in the streets of major cities, a manticore in London, a basilisk in Rome, a kraken that had destroyed an aircraft carrier in the Pacific. It's accelerating, the colonel said, greeting them in the command center. The entity in River Bluff is broadcasting somehow, calling them all. Broadcasting what? Freedom, power, revenge against the world that forgot them, The monsters are answering. Then we stop the broadcast. That's the plan. The plan was simple in concept, terrifying in execution. They would send a strike team into River Bluff, to the heart of the entity's power, and destroy it. The team would consist of Sarah, who could resist the entity's influence, being partly transformed herself, and a dozen others who had shown similar resistance to various cryptid abilities. "We're going to war," Sarah said, looking at the assembled team. "Not against an army, but against a god. Most of us won't come back. But if we succeed, if we stop this thing, we save the world." "And if we fail?" someone asked. "Then the age of monsters begins in earnest, and humanity becomes just another prey species." They armed themselves with weapons both conventional and exotic, guns and grenades, yes, but also symbols and rituals, ancient magic that had been rediscovered in the archives of Site-17. They took artifacts that had been recovered from previous encounters, things that could harm or bind or banish the supernatural. And Sarah took one more thing. The scale, which had grown now become part of her, merged with her flesh. She could feel its power, the Piasa's strength flowing through her veins. She was becoming something new, something that had never existed before, a human with the heart of a dragon. "Ready?" Marcus asked, standing beside her. "Ready." They boarded the helicopters, 13 warriors flying into the heart of darkness, and Sarah Chen, once a professor, once a skeptic, now something else entirely, looked down at the world passing below and wondered if she would ever see it again. River Bluff awaited, transformed by the entity's power into a nightmare landscape of impossible geometry and eldritch horror. The town that had been destroyed by monsters was now being reborn as something worse, a gateway, a throne, a wound in reality through which the entity would enter the world. They landed on the edge of town, in the ruins of what had once been a peaceful community. The air was wrong here, thick and sweet and tasting of copper. The buildings had grown, twisted, merged with each other in organic ways. The sky was the wrong color, swirling with patterns that hurt the eyes. "Welcome home," a voice said, and Sarah saw it. The entity, the thing behind the Piasa and the Thunderbird, the consciousness that had used them as puppets. It had no fixed form, shifting between shapes, now a dragon, now a bird, now something that was neither and both and worse. It was vast, filling the sky, and its eyes, when it had eyes, were filled with malice and hunger. "Sarah Chen," it said, "my killer, my liberator, my bride. I'm here to destroy you. You cannot destroy what has no form. I am thought. I am dream. I am the fear that lives in every heart. Then I'll destroy your vessel, your anchor, whatever lets you touch this world. You would destroy your own kind, your own transformation. We are the same, you and I, both monsters, both gods in waiting. We're nothing alike. No, feel your blood, feel the change. You are becoming me. You are becoming what I was before I grew too large for a single body." Sarah felt it then, the pull, the temptation. The entity was right. She was becoming like it, growing beyond humanity, becoming something vast and terrible. She could let go, could complete the transformation, could join with this thing and rule the world. She could be a god. But she remembered Tom dying in acid, Dave bleeding out in the vault, Gus swallowed whole, the thousands dead in River Bluff, the millions more who would die if the entity succeeded. "No," she said, and raised her weapon. The battle that followed would be told in stories, whispered by survivors, written in classified reports that would never see the light of day. 13 warriors against a god, fighting in a nightmare landscape where physics and logic had no hold. They died, one by one, falling to the entity's power, their bodies twisted and consumed. But they fought. They fought with everything they had, and they hurt it, weakened it, forced it to focus its attention on them instead of the wider world. And Sarah, transformed now beyond recognition, scales covering her skin, wings unfolding from her back, claws extended and teeth bared. Sarah struck the final blow. She didn't use a weapon, she used herself. She embraced the entity, wrapped herself around it, and did what she had learned from the Piasa, from the Thunderbird, from every monster she had ever fought. She consumed it. She swallowed the god, took its power into herself, absorbed its essence and made it part of her own. The pain was beyond description, beyond sanity. Her body tore itself apart and reformed, her mind shattered and reassembled. And when it was over, when the entity was gone and the nightmare ended, Sarah Chen stood alone in the ruins of River Bluff, neither human nor monster but something new. A guardian, a protector, a god-killer who had become a god herself. Marcus found her there, hours later, wandering through the devastation. He didn't recognize her at first. She had grown, changed, become something that filled the sky and the earth simultaneously. But her eyes were still Sarah's eyes, still human, still kind. "Is it over?" he asked. "It's over," she said, her voice like thunder, like waves, like the whisper of scales on stone. "The entity is gone. The awakenings will stop. The monsters will sleep again. And you?" She looked at herself, at the power that crackled around her, at the wings that could darken the sun. "I will watch. I will guard. I will be the thing that keeps other things from waking." "Sarah." "Go, Marcus. Tell them what happened. Tell them that the world is safe for now. Will I see you again? Perhaps in dreams, in storms, in the shadows by the river. I will be there, always watching." He left her there, the last survivor of River Bluff, the first of a new kind of guardian. And Sarah, alone in the ruins, spread her wings and took to the sky, flying out over the Mississippi, out over the world to find her place in the new order she had created. The Piasa Bird was dead. The Thunderbird was dead. But legends never truly die. They only change, evolve, become something new. And somewhere in the deep places, in the dark water and the storm clouds, new legends were already beginning to grow. The end. Thank you for listening to today's stories. If you enjoyed, please leave a like and subscribe, so you don't miss the stories yet to come.